Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin.
The keys jingled in my hand as I locked the main entrance of the Virginia Civil War Museum behind the last departing visitors. Another night shift was beginning, and despite working here for 3 years, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this place after dark. "Good night, Tom. Try not to let the generals spook you tonight," Sarah, the day shift supervisor, called out with a laugh as she gathered her things. She had no idea how those words would come back to haunt me. I settled into my usual routine, making my first rounds through the exhibits. The museum was housed in an old plantation manor that had served as a field hospital during the war. Its wide hallways and high ceilings seemed to amplify every footstep in the empty building. Display cases lined the walls, filled with uniforms, weapons, and personal effects recovered from nearby battlefields. The centerpiece was a massive diorama depicting the Battle of Cedar Creek, with hundreds of carefully painted miniature soldiers frozen in eternal combat. The first few hours passed normally. I checked the security cameras, filled out my logs, and walked the prescribed routes between exhibits. Around midnight, I was doing paperwork in the security office when the temperature suddenly dropped. In Virginia, October nights can get chilly, but this was different. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check the climate control system. As I walked past the diorama room, something caught my eye. I could have sworn one of the miniature soldiers had moved. I'd spent countless hours staring at that display, memorizing every detail, and something was definitely different. A cavalry officer that usually faced north was now pointing his saber east. "You're losing it, old man," I muttered to myself. But when I returned an hour later, 3 more figures had changed position. The knot in my stomach tightened as I studied the display. The moved figures weren't random. They were forming a new battle formation. I pulled out my phone and took pictures, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. As I was documenting the changes, a sound echoed through the hall, the distinct metallic click of a musket being cocked. It came from the weapons display behind me. My hands shook as I turned around. The vintage Springfield rifle in the case was no longer lying flat on its mount. It was standing upright, pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. Other weapons began to move as well, rattling in their cases like living things trying to escape. I ran back to the security office and pulled up the camera feeds. What I saw made my blood run cold. Dark shapes were moving through the exhibits, translucent figures in military uniforms, some Union, some Confederate. They walked through walls and display cases as if they weren't there. But what terrified me most was watching them approach sleeping security guards in the footage from previous nights, standing over them, reaching out with ghostly hands. The cameras began to flicker and die, one by one. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but it emitted only static and what sounded like distant battlefield commands. The temperature dropped even further, my breath coming out in visible puffs. That's when I heard them. Footsteps, dozens of them, marching in perfect unison. They were coming from the East Wing, where we kept the field hospital exhibit. I knew I should leave, call the police, do anything except investigate. The field hospital room was transformed. The electric lights were dead, replaced by ghostly lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The modern display cases had vanished, replaced by blood-stained operating tables and piles of crude medical instruments. The air was thick with the phantom smell of gunpowder and decay. Standing around the tables were figures, some solid enough to seem real, others barely more than wisps of fog in uniform shapes. They were performing surgery on bodies I could somehow see through, their movements precise and desperate. A young Confederate soldier looked right at me, his eyes filled with an agony that transcended death, and whispered, "Help us." I backed away, but they were behind me now too. Soldiers, doctors, nurses, dozens of them, all with that same pleading look. They reached for me with translucent hands, their touch sending waves of ice through my body. Each point of contact flooded my mind with their memories. The terror of charging across open fields into cannon fire, the agony of primitive surgery without anesthesia, the despair of watching friends and brothers die in screaming heaps. My back hit the wall, and I slid down to the floor, overwhelmed by the assault of phantom sensations and borrowed memories. Through my terror, I realized something. They weren't trying to harm me. They were trying to make me understand. You see, the museum wasn't just built on a battlefield. It was built on a mass grave. The bodies of over 300 soldiers lay beneath its foundations, Union and Confederate alike, buried in haste after the battle. Their stories had been sanitized, turned into neat display cases and informative plaques that school children could browse without nightmares. But the dead remembered the truth. Every night they tried to tell it, possessing guests and guards to recreate their final moments, desperate to preserve the brutal reality of their sacrifice. I don't know how long I sat there, sharing their memories, feeling their pain. When I opened my eyes, sunlight was streaming through the windows. Everything was back to normal. Display cases in order, temperature regular, no sign of the night's events. Except for the diorama. The figures had completely rearranged themselves into a perfect recreation of the field hospital scene I'd witnessed. Tiny, painted soldiers lay on operating tables, surrounded by medical staff, and in the corner, a new figure had appeared, a security guard, slumped against the wall, eyes wide with understanding. I submitted my resignation that morning. Sarah tried to convince me to stay, telling me I was the longest-lasting night guard they'd had in years. Now I understood why, but I couldn't leave completely. The dead wouldn't let me. Every few weeks I find myself drawn back to the museum, volunteering as a tour guide. I tell their stories, the real ones, not the sanitized versions in the guidebooks. And sometimes, when I'm speaking to a tour group, I catch glimpses of them standing among the living visitors, nodding in approval. They know I understand now. The war never really ended for them. It just changed forms. Instead of fighting for territory or ideology, they fight against being forgotten, against having their sacrifices reduced to sterile exhibits and gift shop souvenirs. Last week I heard we're getting a new night guard. Young guy just out of college, excited about working around all that history. I wanted to warn him, tell him what really happens in those halls after midnight, but I didn't. Some stories have to be experienced to be believed. And the dead, well, they need someone to tell their stories to. I just hope he's ready to listen. Sometimes at night, I still dream about them. I see their faces, feel their pain, hear their voices begging to be remembered. And sometimes, when I drive past the museum late at night, I swear I can see lights moving inside, even though the building is supposed to be empty. But I don't stop anymore. I've learned that some stories are better left untold. some history better left buried. But if you ever visit the Virginia Civil War Museum, pay attention to the diorama in the main hall. Look closely at the faces of those tiny painted soldiers, and if you think you see one move, if you feel a sudden chill or hear the phantom crack of musket fire, don't dismiss it. The dead have something to say. Whether you want to listen? Well, that's up to you. Just remember, in places where great suffering has occurred, the line between past and present, between living and dead, becomes very thin indeed. And sometimes, if you pay attention, you might learn that the most terrifying stories aren't about monsters or ghosts. They're about the very real horrors humans inflict upon each other, horrors that echo through time, refusing to be forgotten. As for me, I still can't walk past a Civil War memorial without feeling their presence. Their stories have become part of mine, their memories tangled with my own, and on quiet nights, when the wind whistles through old buildings and shadows seem to move of their own accord, I remember what I learned during my time as a night guard. History isn't just words in books or artifacts in cases. Sometimes it reaches out with cold, desperate hands, demanding to be remembered, demanding to be understood. And sometimes, if you're not careful, it pulls you in so deep you can never fully escape. If you thought that was chilling, wait until you hear what comes next. The rusted weather vane on top of our town hall had been there since before anyone could remember. Growing up in Millers Creek, Texas, I never paid much attention to it until I started working as the building's maintenance supervisor last spring. That's when I noticed something wasn't quite right with it. It was an ordinary April morning when I first spotted the peculiarity. I was doing my regular rounds, checking the building's exterior for winter damage, when I noticed the weather vane wasn't moving with the wind like it should. Instead, it pointed stubbornly toward the Peterson family's farm, even though the wind was clearly blowing in the opposite direction. 3 days later, Old Man Peterson was found dead in his cornfield. His body was twisted in an unnatural way, like a piece of metal artwork gone wrong. The police called it a farming accident, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I started keeping track of the weather vane's movements after that. Every few weeks it would stop following the wind and point fixedly at different locations around town. Each time, within days, someone would die at the exact spot it pointed to. The victims were always found in the same way, bodies contorted like twisted metal sculptures. The deaths were spread out enough that nobody else made the connection. A teenager at the high school, a cashier at the grocery store, the librarian, all found in impossible positions, their bodies bent and warped like they'd been caught in some terrible storm. I tried telling Sheriff Cooper about my suspicions, but he dismissed it as coincidence. "Tom," he said, "you're letting your imagination run wild. We get plenty of accidents during tornado season. It's just bad luck." But I knew better. I'd been studying old town records in my spare time, and I found something disturbing. Every 50 years, like clockwork, Millers Creek would face a devastating tornado that would level the entire town. The only exception was 1973, when the then mayor and the entire town council died mysteriously, all found twisted and contorted inside town hall. That's when I found the diary. Hidden in a dusty corner of the building's archive room, it belonged to the man who installed the weather vane in 1873. According to his writings, the weather vane wasn't just a weather predictor. It was a sacrifice collector. It demanded blood to keep the storms at bay. The pattern was clear now. When the weather vane pointed at someone, they weren't just victims of random accidents. They were being chosen. Each death was a payment, a sacrifice to prevent something much worse from happening. Today marks 50 years since the 1973 incident, and the weather vane has been more active than ever. This morning I watched in horror as it spun rapidly before stopping dead still, pointing directly at Town Hall. Inside, the town council is holding an emergency meeting about the strange weather patterns we've been having. I'm writing this from my office in the basement, where I can hear their footsteps above me. The sky outside has turned an unnatural shade of green, and the wind is picking up. The weather vane is still pointing at the building, unwavering. Should I warn them? Would they even believe me? The barometer on my desk is dropping rapidly, and I can hear the wind howling through the old building's bones. The choice seems clear: either the council or the entire town. The meeting is supposed to end in 10 minutes. I could run upstairs right now and try to evacuate everyone. But as I sit here, watching the shadows grow longer and the sky darker, I find myself unable to move. Maybe some prices have to be paid. Some sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. The wind is getting stronger now, and I can hear creaking sounds from upstairs. Soon, very soon, the weather vane will have what it wants. And tomorrow, when they find them, I'll be the only one who knows why their bodies are twisted like the iron scroll work of that ancient weather vane. I tell myself I couldn't have done anything to stop it. But in the dead of night, when the wind whistles through the empty halls of Town Hall, I wonder who will the weather vane point to next. And more importantly, what happens when there's no one left to sacrifice? For now, the storms have passed Miller's Creek by once again. But every morning, I watch that weather vane with dread, waiting to see where it points next. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear it creaking up there, moving by itself, choosing its next victim. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see it pointing straight at me. The last story was unsettling, but this one will leave you speechless. The winter air in Santa Fe hit differently than back home in Chicago. Drier, sharper, more alive somehow. That's what drew me to New Mexico in the first place. Everything felt more real here, more connected to the earth. After 6 months of remote work and basically no social life, I decided to finally do something about my isolation. The Community Arts Center downtown offered evening pottery classes, and since I'd always wanted to learn, it seemed perfect. The building itself was beautiful, all adobe walls and wooden beams, with that distinctly southwestern character I'd fallen in love with. The pottery studio was in the basement, which surprised me at first, but Sandra, our instructor, explained that the consistent temperature was ideal for working with clay. She was probably in her 60s, with silver hair always tied back in a neat bun and hands that moved with practiced grace when she demonstrated techniques. The clay we use here is special, she told us that first night, her voice carrying a hint of pride. It's locally sourced from just outside town. The indigenous peoples of this region have used clay from these deposits for thousands of years. She passed around a block of dark, rich clay to our small class of 8 students. When it reached me, I noticed how different it felt from the processed clay I'd used in my high school art class. This clay felt almost warm to the touch, with a subtle graininess that spoke of its natural origins. The first few classes went smoothly enough. We learned the basics, wedging the clay to remove air bubbles, centering it on the wheel, pulling up walls to form cylinders. I wasn't great at it, but I enjoyed the meditative quality of the work, the way the clay moved under my hands, responding to pressure and movement. Sometimes I'd zone out completely, lost in the rhythmic spin of the wheel and the feel of wet clay sliding between my fingers. It was during our fourth class that things started feeling off. I was working on a simple bowl, trying to get the walls even, when I noticed something strange in the clay. As I pulled up the walls, I could have sworn I saw something move within the material itself, like a ripple or a shadow, but inside the clay rather than on its surface. I blinked hard and looked again, but whatever it was had vanished. "Everything all right, Rachel?" Sandra asked, appearing beside my wheel. I laughed nervously. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." The clay seemed to move on its own for a second there. Something flickered across Sandra's face. Concern? Fear? But it was gone so quickly, I thought I'd imagined it. "The clay does have a life of its own sometimes," she said carefully. "That's what makes it such a powerful medium." I tried to shake off the weird moment, but over the next few classes, similar incidents kept occurring. While trimming the foot of a nearly finished pot, I could have sworn I heard whispers coming from the clay. Not words exactly, but something that sounded almost like voice. During another session, I noticed that the texture of my clay had changed partway through throwing, becoming almost flesh-like beneath my fingers before returning to normal. Other students started mentioning strange experiences too. Maria, a retired nurse who worked at the wheel next to mine, said her pots kept developing faces in them, subtle impressions that appeared in the clay even though she hadn't carved them. Josh, a college student, complained that his clay felt unusually warm, almost hot sometimes, despite the cool basement temperature. Sandra never directly addressed these concerns. She would just nod thoughtfully and suggest we focus on our technique, or remind us that clay was a natural material with its own quirks. But I started noticing how she watched us more intently while we worked, especially when we were preparing pieces for firing. The real horror began the night of our first major firing. We'd accumulated enough pieces to fill the large gas kiln, and Sandra had scheduled an evening loading session. As we carefully placed our greenware into the kiln, I noticed that all of our pieces had taken on a strange quality. The surfaces seemed to shift and move in the dim light, like something was trying to push through from the inside. "Does anyone else see that?" Maria whispered, pointing to a vase Josh had made. There was definitely a face pressing against the clay from within, like a person trying to break through a membrane. As we watched, it receded back into the surface, leaving the pot smooth once again. Sandra cleared her throat. "Let's finish loading quickly," she said, her voice tight. "The kiln needs to be started at exactly the right time." That's when I noticed the marks on the kiln's exterior, subtle symbols that looked Native American in origin, carved into the bricks. The keys jingled in my hand as I locked the main entrance of the Virginia Civil War Museum, behind the last departing visitors. Another night shift was beginning, and despite working here for 3 years, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this place after dark. "Good night, Tom. Try not to let the generals spook you tonight," Sarah, the day shift supervisor, called out with a laugh as she gathered her things. She had no idea how those words would come back to haunt me. I settled into my usual routine, making my first rounds through the exhibits. The museum was housed in an old plantation manor that had served as a field hospital during the war. Its wide hallways and high ceilings seemed to amplify every footstep in the empty building. Display cases lined the walls, filled with uniforms, weapons, and personal effects recovered from nearby battlefields. The centerpiece was a massive diorama depicting the Battle of Cedar Creek, with hundreds of carefully painted miniature soldiers frozen in eternal combat. The first few hours passed normally. I checked the security cameras, filled out my logs, and walked the prescribed routes between exhibits. Around midnight, I was doing paperwork in the security office when the temperature suddenly dropped. In Virginia, October nights can get chilly, but this was different. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check the climate control system. As I walked past the diorama room, something caught my eye. I could have sworn one of the miniature soldiers had moved. I'd spent countless hours staring at that display, memorizing every detail, and something was definitely different. A cavalry officer that usually faced north was now pointing his saber east. "You're losing it, old man," I muttered to myself. But when I returned an hour later, 3 more figures had changed position. The knot in my stomach tightened as I studied the display. The moved figures weren't random. They were forming a new battle formation. I pulled out my phone and took pictures, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. As I was documenting the changes, a sound echoed through the hall, the distinct metallic click of a musket being cocked. It came from the weapons display behind me. My hands shook as I turned around. The vintage Springfield rifle in the case was no longer lying flat on its mount. It was standing upright, pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. Other weapons began to move as well, rattling in their cases like living things trying to escape. I ran back to the security office and pulled up the camera feeds. What I saw made my blood run cold. Dark shapes were moving through the exhibits, translucent figures in military uniforms, some Union, some Confederate. They walked through walls and display cases as if they weren't there. But what terrified me most was watching them approach sleeping security guards in the footage from previous nights, standing over them, reaching out with ghostly hands. The cameras began to flicker and die, one by one. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but it emitted only static and what sounded like distant battlefield commands. The temperature dropped even further, my breath coming out in visible puffs. That's when I heard them. Footsteps, dozens of them, marching in perfect unison. They were coming from the East Wing, where we kept the field hospital exhibit. I knew I should leave, call the police, do anything except investigate. The field hospital room was transformed. The electric lights were dead, replaced by ghostly lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The modern display cases had vanished, replaced by blood-stained operating tables and piles of crude medical instruments. The air was thick with the phantom smell of gunpowder and decay. Standing around the tables were figures, some solid enough to seem real, others barely more than wisps of fog in uniform shapes. They were performing surgery on bodies I could somehow see through, their movements precise and desperate. A young Confederate soldier looked right at me, his eyes filled with an agony that transcended death, and whispered, "Help us." I backed away, but they were behind me now too. Soldiers, doctors, nurses, dozens of them, all with that same pleading look. They reached for me with translucent hands, their touch sending waves of ice through my body. Each point of contact flooded my mind with their memories. The terror of charging across open fields into cannon fire, the agony of primitive surgery without anesthesia, the despair of watching friends and brothers die in screaming heaps. My back hit the wall, and I slid down to the floor, overwhelmed by the assault of phantom sensations and borrowed memories. Through my terror, I realized something. They weren't trying to harm me. They were trying to make me understand. You see, the museum wasn't just built on a battlefield. It was built on a mass grave. The bodies of over 300 soldiers lay beneath its foundations, Union and Confederate alike. buried in haste after the battle. Their stories had been sanitized, turned into neat display cases and informative plaques that school children could browse without nightmares. But the dead remembered the truth. Every night they tried to tell it, possessing guests and guards to recreate their final moments, desperate to preserve the brutal reality of their sacrifice. I don't know how long I sat there, sharing their memories, feeling their pain. When I opened my eyes, sunlight was streaming through the windows. Everything was back to normal. Display cases in order, temperature regular, no sign of the night's events. Except for the diorama. The figures had completely rearranged themselves into a perfect recreation of the field hospital scene I'd witnessed. Tiny painted soldiers lay on operating tables, surrounded by medical staff, and in the corner, a new figure had appeared, a security guard, slumped against the wall, eyes wide with understanding. I submitted my resignation that morning. Sarah tried to convince me to stay, telling me I was the longest-lasting night guard they'd had in years. Now I understood why, but I couldn't leave completely. The dead wouldn't let me. Every few weeks I find myself drawn back to the museum, volunteering as a tour guide. I tell their stories, the real ones, not the sanitized versions in the guidebooks. And sometimes, when I'm speaking to a tour group, I catch glimpses of them standing among the living visitors, nodding in approval. They know I understand now. The war never really ended for them. It just changed forms. Instead of fighting for territory or ideology, they fight against being forgotten, against having their sacrifices reduced to sterile exhibits and gift shop souvenirs. Last week I heard we're getting a new night guard. Young guy just out of college, excited about working around all that history. I wanted to warn him, tell him what really happens in those halls after midnight, but I didn't. Some stories have to be experienced to be believed. And the dead, well, they need someone to tell their stories to. I just hope he's ready to listen. Sometimes at night, I still dream about them. I see their faces, feel their pain, hear their voices begging to be remembered. And sometimes, when I drive past the museum late at night, I swear I can see lights moving inside, even though the building is supposed to be empty. But I don't stop anymore. I've learned that some stories are better left untold, some history better left buried. But if you ever visit the Virginia Civil War Museum, pay attention to the diorama in the main hall. Look closely at the faces of those tiny painted soldiers. And if you think you see one move, if you feel a sudden chill or hear the phantom crack of musket fire, don't dismiss it. The dead have something to say. Whether you want to listen? Well, that's up to you. Just remember, in places where great suffering has occurred, the line between past and present, between living and dead, becomes very thin indeed. And sometimes, if you pay attention, you might learn that the most terrifying stories aren't about monsters or ghosts. They're about the very real horrors humans inflict upon each other, horrors that echo through time, refusing to be forgotten. As for me, I still can't walk past a Civil War memorial without feeling their presence. Their stories have become part of mine, their memories tangled with my own, and on quiet nights, when the wind whistles through old buildings and shadows seem to move of their own accord, I remember what I learned during my time as a night guard. History isn't just words in books or artifacts in cases. Sometimes it reaches out with cold, desperate hands, demanding to be remembered, demanding to be understood. And sometimes, if you're not careful, it pulls you in so deep you can never fully escape. If you thought that was chilling, Wait until you hear what comes next. The rusted weather vane on top of our town hall had been there since before anyone could remember. As I watched, the shadows began to take shape. I saw myself, clear as day, working in the shop. But I wasn't alone. Dark figures moved through the aisles, their faces hidden. In the vision, I was unaware of them until it was too late. I won't describe what I saw next, but I blew out the candle with shaking hands. That's when I started researching. In the shop's ancient ledgers, I found entries from the 1700s about a candle maker who lived through Charleston's worst plague outbreak. As bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, he found a way to preserve the dead in his craft. The town praised him for his beautiful candles, never knowing their true composition. I tried to warn Mr. Morton, but he wouldn't listen. "These are our best-selling items in years," he said. "We're having a special holiday event tomorrow night. Every customer gets a free candle lighting demonstration." The next evening, the shop was packed. Dozens of people held their candles, waiting for the lighting ceremony. I tried to stop it, but Mr. Morton had already started passing out matches. As the first flames flickered to life, the air grew thick and heavy. More candles lit, and the shadows began to dance. The screaming started when people began seeing their visions. But something was different this time. With so many candles burning at once, the visions weren't just visible to the holders. Everyone could see everyone else's death. The shadows grew larger, more solid. They moved among the crowd, touching people with cold, waxy hands. I ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew hotter, thick with the smell of burning wax and that sickly sweet undertone I now recognized as something far worse. I managed to escape, but I still don't know how. The shop now stands empty, its windows dark. The police found no bodies, just dozens of half-burned candles and puddles of red wax that they couldn't explain. Mr. Morton was never seen again. Sometimes, walking past the shop at night, I see lights flickering in the windows. And on very quiet evenings, when the tourist crowds have gone home, you can hear it, the soft sound of dozens of candles being lit, one by one, and the whispered question, "Do you want to see?" The strangest part? Every full moon, a new candle appears in the window display. They're beautiful things, deep burgundy with intricate patterns, and though the shop is locked up tight, they say if you press your hand against the glass, someone inside will offer you a match. I've never gone back inside, but I know the truth about those candles now. Each one contains a story, preserved in wax, and with every flame lit, a new story begins. Sometimes I wonder about all those missing people, and whether they're still there, their essence captured in burning wax, waiting to show others their final moments. So if you're ever in Charleston's historic district and see a shop with burgundy candles in the window, walk away. No matter how beautiful they are, no matter how much you want to know your future, don't stop. Because once you see what the candles want to show you, you might become part of their collection. Just another story waiting to be told in flickering candlelight. The shop is still there, you know. Some say they've seen new candles in the window, each one a different shade of red. And late at night, when the moon is full and the tourists have gone home, you might hear the soft strike of a match and see a warm, inviting glow through the dusty glass. But whatever you do, don't go inside, because in that old shop on the corner, there are some lights that, once lit, can never be extinguished. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers of the candlemaker calling out to passers-by, Would you like to see your story? All it takes is a single match. If you think you've seen it all, this next story will prove you wrong. It started as a normal summer weekend when I got the call to photograph the Jensen Mills wedding. As a freelance photographer in Charleston, I'd shot dozens of weddings at historic plantation houses, but Magnolia Grove was different. The commission paid double my usual rate, and the venue's photos online looked stunning. White columns rising 3 stories high, Spanish moss draping ancient oaks, and manicured gardens perfect for romantic shots. When I drove up the long gravel drive that Friday afternoon for the rehearsal, something felt off. The house loomed larger than in the photos, its windows like dark eyes watching my approach. The paint wasn't the crisp white I'd seen online, but a sickly yellow-gray, peeling in long strips like dead skin. Still, I figured old houses always look a bit creepy, and I'd dealt with run-down venues before. Sarah, the wedding coordinator, met me on the front steps. She was young, probably mid-20s like me, with a tablet clutched to her chest and dark circles under her eyes. "You must be Alex," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks for coming early. We've had some issues with previous photographers." I nodded, hauling my equipment from the car. "No problem. Better to scope out the best spots before tomorrow." The humidity pressed against my skin like a wet blanket, and my shirt was already sticking to my back. "Mind giving me a tour?" Sarah's smile flickered. "Of course, but we need to go over some ground rules first." She glanced at the house, then lowered her voice. "Never photograph the same person twice in the same spot. Don't use the mirror in the bridal suite for any shots. And most importantly, if you see anyone in period clothing, do not include them in any photos. They're part of the house's historical experience program." I laughed, but Sarah didn't join in. "Sure, no problem. Though those seem like odd rules for wedding photos. Trust me," she said, turning toward the house. "You'll want to follow them." The interior was cooler, but somehow more oppressive. Despite the tall windows, shadows clung to every corner. The grand staircase curved up like a spine, and the chandelier's crystals caught the light in strange ways, sending rainbow fragments skittering across the walls. I started taking test shots, checking the lighting. That's when I noticed something odd in my viewfinder. In the mirror behind the staircase, I could see reflections of people in elaborate 1800s clothing, women in hoop skirts, men in tailcoats. But when I lowered my camera, the mirror showed only the empty foyer. My hands started shaking. "Sarah?" I called out, but she had disappeared somewhere in the house's depths. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe some kind of historical projection system. But as I moved through the rooms, taking practice shots, more unexplainable things kept happening. In every photo I reviewed, the people in period clothing appeared in the background, getting closer. Their faces were blurred at first, but with each shot, they became clearer and more horrifying. Their eyes were empty black holes, their mouths stretched in impossible grins, and in each successive photo, they were arranged in grotesque tableaus of death, hanging from the chandelier, sprawled on the stairs in pools of blood, faces frozen in eternal screams. But the worst part? I started recognizing the modern wedding party in these poses. The bride's photo showed her in her wedding dress, but with a musket wound in her chest. The groom appeared with a noose around his neck. Each member of the wedding party appeared dead in the exact same ways as their historical counterparts. I tried deleting the photos, but they wouldn't go away. I changed memory cards, but the images transferred themselves somehow. When I went to warn Sarah, she just nodded sadly. "It happens every time," she whispered. "The house. It demands payment. Every celebration here must be balanced with tragedy. It's been this way since the massacre of 1859, when a wedding party was murdered by raiders. Now the house recreates it, over and over." "We have to stop the wedding," I said, but Sarah shook her head. "We can't. It's too late. The house has already chosen them. All we can do is document it." I wanted to run, to warn everyone, but something kept me there. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe the house itself wouldn't let me leave. The next day, I photographed the wedding as planned. Everything seemed normal at first. The ceremony, the reception, the dancing. But as the sun set, the shadows grew longer, and I saw them coming. The figures from the photographs, emerging from every dark corner. The last photo I took that night shows the entire wedding party, their faces transformed into those same horrible grins, recreating the positions I'd seen in my test shots. I haven't picked up a camera since then. But sometimes, when I look at the photos from that day, and they appear on every device I own, no matter how many times I delete them, I swear the figures are still moving, still getting closer, frame by frame. The wedding announcement in the local paper the next day said the entire party had vanished without a trace. The only evidence they were ever there. My photos, each showing exactly how they would disappear, how the house would take them, just like all the others before. Magnolia Grove still hosts weddings. I see the ads sometimes. Historic Southern charm, they promise. Unforgettable memories. They don't mention the real price of admission. They don't tell you that the house demands every celebration be paid for in blood, that every joy must be balanced with tragedy. They don't tell you that somewhere in those shadowy halls, the wedding parties of the past are still dancing their eternal, macabre dance. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear the music drifting from those grounds, a haunting waltz played on unseen instruments, accompanied by the sounds of screaming. That was just the beginning. The real terror lies in the next story. After 5 years as a park ranger at Yellowstone, I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at me. Bear encounters, lost hikers, extreme weather. It was all part of the job. But what happened last summer changed everything I thought I knew about nature and history. It started during a routine patrol of the lesser-visited northern trails. My partner Sarah and I were checking on reports of unusual wildlife activity when we stumbled upon an opening in the rock face that wasn't on any of our maps. The entrance was partially hidden behind overgrown vegetation, but something about it caught Sarah's attention. "Hey, Mark, come look at this," she called out, brushing away some vines. Her flashlight beam revealed ancient petroglyphs carved into the rock around the cave mouth. I'd seen Native American rock art before, but these were different. The figures were crude yet incredibly detailed, showing what looked like hunting scenes. But the creatures being hunted, they didn't look quite right. "We should document this," Sarah said, already pulling out her camera. "The archaeology department will want to know about it." That's when we heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from deep within the cave. It could have been water dripping or echoes carried from somewhere else in the park. But something about the steady beat made the hair on my neck stand up. Sarah must have felt it too, because she lowered her camera and went quiet. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The archaeology team arrived to study the petroglyphs, and more cave openings were discovered. The initial excitement of the find was overshadowed by a growing sense of unease. 3 different research teams reported hearing the same thumping sound, always deeper in the cave system than anyone had ventured. Then the disappearances started. It was a family of 4 first, tourists, who had wandered off the marked trail near one of the cave entrances. We found their campsite intact, meals half-eaten, as if they had just gotten up and walked away. The search lasted 2 weeks before being called off. The official report blamed it on bears, but I knew better. The ground around their camp had strange markings that matched patterns in the petroglyphs. A month later, we lost 2 graduate students who were mapping the cave system. Their equipment was found arranged in a perfect circle, surrounding more of those ancient symbols scratched into the dirt. The thumping had gotten louder, more frequent. Some rangers swore they could hear chanting mixed in with it now. I tried warning the Park Service about closing off the area, but without concrete evidence, they wouldn't listen. Tourism was up thanks to the archaeological finds and money talks. Sarah was the only one who believed me. We spent our off hours researching similar petroglyphs, trying to understand what the ancient artists had been trying to tell us. The breakthrough came too late. Sarah decoded part of the imagery. They weren't just hunting scenes, they were warnings. The creatures in the drawings weren't prey, they were the hunters, and according to the glyphs, they emerged every few hundred years to feed. The night everything came to a head, we had a tour group of 12 people near the main cave entrance. I was off duty but nearby, reviewing Sarah's notes. The screaming started just after sunset. By the time I reached the cave, there was nothing but silence and the ever-present thumping, now so loud it shook loose rocks from the ceiling. I found them arranged in a massive pattern that mirrored one of the largest petroglyphs, 12 bodies placed with horrible precision. Sarah was among them. They weren't dead, not exactly. Their chests rose and fell with shallow breaths, but their eyes were open and empty, staring at something I couldn't see. The official investigation blamed toxic gases from the cave system. The Park Service sealed off the entrances with concrete and steel. They transferred me to Yosemite, probably hoping distance would keep me quiet. But I know what I saw in those caves. I've memorized every detail of those ancient warnings, hoping to prevent it from happening again, because according to the petroglyphs, the hunting grounds stretch under most of Wyoming, and there are more cave entrances out there, still undiscovered. Sometimes at night, I press my ear to the ground and listen. The thumping is fainter here, but it's there, always getting louder. And sometimes, when I check the news from my old park, I see the missing persons reports. 1 or 2 at a time now, arranged in patterns only I recognize. The hunters are patient, they can afford to be. After all, they've been feeding this way for thousands of years. I've tried telling this story before, but most people don't believe me. They say the trauma of losing Sarah affected my mind. Maybe they're right. But if you're ever hiking in Wyoming and you hear a rhythmic thumping in the ground, or see strange symbols carved in rock, don't stop to take pictures, don't investigate, just run. Because the next hunting season is coming. And according to the petroglyphs, it's going to be the biggest one yet. Still breathing easy? Let's see if you can after this next tale. Working at my family's funeral home wasn't my first choice of career. But after Dad's heart attack last spring, someone had to help Mom keep things running. That's how I found myself back in Cedar Springs, Michigan, living above Hawthorne family funeral services, just like when I was a kid. The building hadn't changed much in the 15 years since I'd left for college. The same dark wood paneling lined the walls, and that familiar mix of flowers and formaldehyde still hung in the air. Even the old family photos remained exactly where they'd always been, arranged in neat rows along the hallway leading to the preparation room. What was different were the cats. So many cats. Mom had always kept one or two around. Supposedly, they were good at keeping mice away from the basement storage. But now, there were at least 8 of them prowling the halls. Most were typical shelter rescues. A few tabbies, a couple of black cats, an orange fellow missing part of his ear. The newest addition was a sleek Siamese with striking blue eyes that Mom had named Lady. "They're good company," Mom would say whenever I brought up the growing feline population. "And they're no trouble at all. Such well-behaved darlings." She wasn't wrong about their behavior. I'd never seen such eerily well-mannered cats. They never knocked things over or clawed the furniture. They used their litter boxes faithfully and didn't fight with each other. They just watched all the time. Watching with those unblinking eyes, I first noticed something odd about them during Mr. Peterson's viewing. He was a local farmer who'd passed suddenly from an aneurysm. As his family and friends filed through to pay their respects, I spotted 3 of the cats lined up in the doorway, staring intently at the open casket. Later that night, I found them curled up together on top of Mr. Peterson's photo in the hallway. 2 days after the funeral, his wife had a stroke. She didn't make it. I might not have thought much about it, except the same thing happened the following week with Mrs. Henderson, a retired school teacher. The cats, 5 of them this time, gathered around her photo the night before her viewing. The next afternoon, her sister collapsed in our parking lot, dead before the ambulance arrived. That's when I started paying closer attention. Every time we had a new client, the cats would pick someone from the mourners. They'd find that person's photo, whether it was hanging in our hallway or tucked into the memorial display, and sleep on or around it. Within days, that person would die. I tried telling Mom, but she just smiled, that sad smile she'd been wearing since Dad got sick. "Grief does strange things to the mind, sweetie. You're seeing patterns that aren't there." But I knew what I was seeing. The cats never got it wrong. I started documenting everything. Dates, names, which cats were involved. I noticed they seemed to take turns, rotating through different combinations. The Siamese, Lady, was always the leader when she participated. The others would follow her lead, arranging themselves around whichever photo she chose. After 3 months, I had recorded 28 deaths. 28 perfect predictions. That's when I discovered the Cat Lady Support Group. It was a small flyer tacked to the bulletin board at the local coffee shop. "Feline Friends Forever, a support group for cat lovers," followed by an address and meeting time. Something about the simple black text and lack of clip art caught my eye. Most cat lady meetups had at least a few paw prints or whiskers decorating their advertisements. I don't know why I went. Curiosity, maybe, or desperation to talk to someone who might understand. The meeting was held in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. As I walked up the creaking porch steps, I could see dozens of cats in the windows, their eyes gleaming in the twilight. The woman who answered the door looked exactly like what you'd expect. Gray hair in a messy bun, oversized sweater covered in cat hair, multiple rings on her fingers. "Welcome, dear," she said warmly. "I'm Martha. We've been expecting you." Inside, the house smelled strongly of incense and cat litter. About a dozen women sat in a circle in what must have been the living room, though every surface was covered in cat beds, climbing trees, and scratching posts. Cats of every size and color lounged everywhere I looked. "Please, join us," Martha said, gesturing to an empty chair. We have so much to discuss. The women introduced themselves one by one, each with a similar story. They all worked around death somehow: hospice nurses, cemetery groundskeepers, emergency room staff, and they all had cats who could predict deaths. They're not really cats, you see, Martha explained, stroking a massive Maine Coon in her lap. They're collectors, gatherers of souls who are owed to death. Owed? I asked. Everyone gets one death, said a thin woman named Joyce. But sometimes people cheat. They survive when they shouldn't. A miracle recovery. A near-miss accident. A last-minute rescue. Death doesn't like to be cheated. The collectors find those who have escaped and mark them for collection. The photos help them keep track, added another woman. That's why they sleep on them. It's how they claim their assignments. I thought about all those pictures in our hallway. Generations of local families, all under the watchful eyes of our cats. But why are you telling me this? I asked. Why form a support group? Martha smiled, and something in her expression made my skin crawl. Because we serve the collectors. We help them gather what they're owed. And we've been watching you, dear. We think you'd make an excellent addition to our little family. That's when I noticed the doors had been quietly closed and locked. The cats were moving now, flowing into the room like a furry tide, surrounding my chair. I saw Lady among them, her blue eyes glowing in the dim light. Don't worry, Martha said softly. It doesn't hurt. Think of it as an initiation. I managed to get away that night, though I'm still not entirely sure how. The next morning, police found the house empty except for dozens of carefully posed bodies, arranged as if sleeping, curled up like cats. No trace of Martha or the other women was ever found. Mom says I imagined the whole thing. The support group, the warnings, everything. She points out that the cats are still just cats, sweet, harmless creatures who keep her company while she grieves for Dad. But I know better now. I watch them watching the photos, choosing their next targets. Sometimes I think about warning people, but who would believe me? Besides, death always collects what it's owed. The cats make sure of that. I still work at the funeral home, still live above it with Mom and our ever-growing family of cats. Lady had kittens last month, beautiful little Siamese with striking blue eyes. Mom was thrilled. This morning I found them all curled up around my photo in the hallway. I wonder how long I have left. But the strangest part? I'm not even scared anymore. After all, everyone dies eventually. At least I know I'll be in good company when my time comes. Just don't let your cat sleep on your picture. Trust me on this one. The darkness only deepens with each story. And this next one is pitch black. It was my first week as a teaching assistant at Pine Grove Elementary in western Connecticut. The crisp September air still carried hints of summer, and the maple trees lining Old Mill Road were just starting to show touches of orange. Everything seemed perfectly normal that Tuesday morning as I helped direct the steady stream of minivans and SUVs dropping off sleepy-eyed kids for another school day. Mrs. Henderson, the head crossing guard, caught my attention with a sharp whistle. She was a fixture at Pine Grove, having served as crossing guard for over 30 years. The kids loved her, but something about her always seemed off. Maybe it was how intensely she watched each child cross, or how she muttered under her breath while making strange gestures with her free hand. Remember? She called out to me, her voice carrying an edge I couldn't quite place. No one crosses outside the designated times. Not ever. She tapped her ancient-looking brass whistle for emphasis. I nodded, though I thought the rule seemed excessive. The school had recently installed new traffic lights and clearly marked crosswalks. Plus, Old Mill Road wasn't particularly busy outside of drop-off and pickup times. That afternoon, I noticed a small group of third graders hanging back after the final bell. They were huddled near the crosswalk, giggling and whispering. As I approached, I overheard snippets of their conversation. Disappeared right there. My brother said the road eats them, only during the wrong times. The children scattered when they saw me, leaving behind a crude chalk drawing on the sidewalk. It showed stick figures crossing a road, with dark scribbles reaching up from below to grab them. I dismissed it as typical playground gossip. But later that week, I overheard two teachers discussing something troubling in the break room. "Third one this year," one whispered. "Always when they cross at the wrong time. The parents just forget," the other replied, like they never existed. I started paying more attention after that. I noticed how Mrs. Henderson would sometimes freeze mid-stride, head cocked as if listening to voices only she could hear. The way she would frantically wave children back if they got too close to the crosswalk between designated crossing times. The strange symbols I sometimes spotted her drawing in the dirt with her worn boots, only to quickly scuff them away. One morning I arrived early to find her kneeling by the crosswalk, placing what looked like small bundles of herbs at each corner. When she saw me watching, she quickly stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "The old ways must be respected," she said simply, her eyes distant. I started researching the area's history. The library's local history section held dusty records of the Mohegan tribe that once lived here. Old Mill Road, it turned out, was built directly over what they called the Spirit Path, a sacred route their shamans used to guide souls to the afterlife. But it was what I found in the newspaper archives that truly chilled me. Every few years, like clockwork, children would vanish without a trace near Pine Grove Elementary. The articles were frustratingly vague, as if the writers themselves couldn't quite grasp the details. Parents were quoted as seeming confused, unable to provide clear descriptions of their missing children. The cases were always closed without resolution. Then came the solar eclipse. We'd been preparing for weeks, distributing special glasses and planning viewing activities. The eclipse was scheduled to reach totality just after morning drop-off time. That morning felt wrong from the start. The air was too still, the birds completely silent. Mrs. Henderson wasn't at her usual post. Instead, I found her standing in the middle of the crosswalk, arms outstretched, whispering rapidly in what sounded like Mohegan. A school bus approached as the sky began to darken. I watched in horror as Mrs. Henderson stepped aside, lowering her arms. The bus crossed exactly as totality began. In that moment of perfect darkness I heard it, a sound like ancient wood creaking, like stones grinding against each other deep underground. The street seemed to ripple just for a second. When the light returned, the bus was gone. No debris, no skid marks, nothing. Just empty road. The strangest part? No one else seemed to notice. The principal didn't mention any missing bus. No parents called about missing children. When I checked the school records later, there was no bus scheduled for that morning. Mrs. Henderson retired the next day. Her replacement is younger, more cheerful. She doesn't enforce the crossing times quite so strictly. But sometimes, when I'm alone at the crosswalk after hours, I hear whispers carried on the wind, the sound of children laughing, but muffled as if from very far away, or perhaps from somewhere deep below the pavement. I've started enforcing the crossing times myself now. Some rules exist for reasons we're better off not understanding. The only evidence they were ever there. My photos, each showing exactly how they would disappear, how the house would take them. Just like all the others before, Magnolia Grove still hosts weddings. I see the ads sometimes. Historic Southern charm, they promise. Unforgettable memories. They don't mention the real price of admission. They don't tell you that the house demands every celebration be paid for in blood, that every joy must be balanced with tragedy. They don't tell you that somewhere in those shadowy halls, the wedding parties of the past are still dancing their eternal, macabre dance. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear the music drifting from those grounds, a haunting waltz played on unseen instruments, accompanied by the sounds of screaming. That was just the beginning. The real terror lies in the next story. After 5 years as a park ranger at Yellowstone, I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at me. Bear encounters, lost hikers, extreme weather. It was all part of the job. But what happened last summer changed everything I thought I knew about nature and history. It started during a routine patrol of the lesser-visited northern trails. My partner Sarah and I were checking on reports of unusual wildlife activity when we stumbled upon an opening in the rock face that wasn't on any of our maps. The entrance was partially hidden behind overgrown vegetation, but something about it caught Sarah's attention. "Hey, Mark, come look at this," she called out, brushing away some vines. Her flashlight beam revealed ancient petroglyphs carved into the rock around the cave mouth. I'd seen Native American rock art before, but these were different. The figures were crude yet incredibly detailed, showing what looked like hunting scenes. But the creatures being hunted, they didn't look quite right. "We should document this," Sarah said, already pulling out her camera. "The archaeology department will want to know about it." That's when we heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping coming from deep within the cave. It could have been water dripping or echoes carried from somewhere else in the park. But something about the steady beat made the hair on my neck stand up. Sarah must have felt it too, because she lowered her camera and went quiet. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The archaeology team arrived to study the petroglyphs, and more cave openings were discovered. The initial excitement of the find was overshadowed by a growing sense of unease. 3 different research teams reported hearing the same thumping sound, always deeper in the cave system than anyone had ventured. Then the disappearances started. It was a family of 4 first, tourists, who had wandered off the marked trail near one of the cave entrances. We found their campsite intact, meals half-eaten, as if they had just gotten up and walked away. The search lasted 2 weeks before being called off. The official report blamed it on bears, but I knew better. The ground around their camp had strange markings that matched patterns in the petroglyphs. A month later, we lost 2 graduate students who were mapping the cave system. Their equipment was found arranged in a perfect circle, surrounding more of those ancient symbols scratched into the dirt. The thumping had gotten louder, more frequent. Some rangers swore they could hear chanting mixed in with it now. I tried warning the Park Service about closing off the area, but without concrete evidence, they wouldn't listen. Tourism was up thanks to the archaeological finds and money talks. Sarah was the only one who believed me. We spent our off hours researching similar petroglyphs, trying to understand what the ancient artists had been trying to tell us. The breakthrough came too late. Sarah decoded part of the imagery. They weren't just hunting scenes, they were warnings. The creatures in the drawings weren't prey, they were the hunters, and according to the glyphs, they emerged every few hundred years to feed. The night everything came to a head, we had a tour group of 12 people near the main cave entrance. I was off duty but nearby, reviewing Sarah's notes. The screaming started just after sunset. By the time I reached the cave, there was nothing but silence and the ever-present thumping, now so loud it shook loose rocks from the ceiling. I found them arranged in a massive pattern that mirrored one of the largest petroglyphs, 12 bodies placed with horrible precision. Sarah was among them. They weren't dead, not exactly. Their chests rose and fell with shallow breaths, but their eyes were open and empty, staring at something I couldn't see. The official investigation blamed toxic gases from the cave system. The Park Service sealed off the entrances with concrete and steel. They transferred me to Yosemite, probably hoping distance would keep me quiet. But I know what I saw in those caves. I've memorized every detail of those ancient warnings, hoping to prevent it from happening again. Because according to the petroglyphs, the hunting grounds stretch under most of Wyoming. And there are more cave entrances out there, still undiscovered. Sometimes at night, I press my ear to the ground and listen. The thumping is fainter here, but it's there, always getting louder. And sometimes, when I check the news from my old park, I see the missing persons reports. 1 or 2 at a time now, arranged in patterns only I recognize. The hunters are patient, they can afford to be. After all, they've been feeding this way for thousands of years. I've tried telling this story before, but most people don't believe me. They say the trauma of losing Sarah affected my mind. Maybe they're right. But if you're ever hiking in Wyoming and you hear a rhythmic thumping in the ground, or see strange symbols carved in rock, don't stop to take pictures, don't investigate, just run. Because the next hunting season is coming. And according to the petroglyphs, it's going to be the biggest one yet. Still breathing easy? Let's see if you can after this next tale. Working at my family's funeral home wasn't my first choice of career. But after Dad's heart attack last spring, someone had to help Mom keep things running. That's how I found myself back in Cedar Springs, Michigan, living above Hawthorne family funeral services, just like when I was a kid. The building hadn't changed much in the 15 years since I'd left for college. The same dark wood paneling lined the walls, and that familiar mix of flowers and formaldehyde still hung in the air. Even the old family photos remained exactly where they'd always been, arranged in neat rows along the hallway leading to the preparation room. What was different were the cats. So many cats. Mom had always kept 1 or 2 around. Supposedly they were good at keeping mice away from the basement storage. But now there were at least 8 of them prowling the halls. Most were typical shelter rescues. A few tabbies, a couple of black cats, an orange fellow missing part of his ear. The newest addition was a sleek Siamese with striking blue eyes that Mom had named Lady. They're good company, Mom would say whenever I brought up the growing feline population. And they're no trouble at all. Such well-behaved darlings. She wasn't wrong about their behavior. I'd never seen such eerily well-mannered cats. They never knocked things over or clawed the furniture. They used their litter boxes faithfully and didn't fight with each other. They just watched all the time. Watching with those unblinking eyes, I first noticed something odd about them during Mr. Peterson's viewing. He was a local farmer who'd passed suddenly from an aneurysm. As his family and friends filed through to pay their respects, I spotted 3 of the cats lined up in the doorway, staring intently at the open casket. Later that night, I found them curled up together on top of Mr. Peterson's photo in the hallway. 2 days after the funeral, his wife had a stroke. She didn't make it. I might not have thought much about it, except the same thing happened the following week with Mrs. Henderson, a retired school teacher. The cats, 5 of them this time, gathered around her photo the night before her viewing. The next afternoon, her sister collapsed in our parking lot, dead before the ambulance arrived. That's when I started paying closer attention. Every time we had a new client, the cats would pick someone from the mourners. They'd find that person's photo, whether it was hanging in our hallway or tucked into the memorial display, and sleep on or around it. Within days, that person would die. I tried telling Mom, but she just smiled, that sad smile she'd been wearing since Dad got sick. Grief does strange things to the mind, sweetie. You're seeing patterns that aren't there. But I knew what I was seeing. The cats never got it wrong. I started documenting everything. Dates, names, which cats were involved. I noticed they seemed to take turns, rotating through different combinations. The Siamese lady was always the leader when she participated. The others would follow her lead, arranging themselves around whichever photo she chose. After 3 months, I had recorded 28 deaths. The beading seemed to shift under my fingers, and was it getting tighter around my neck? How does it fit? Madame Beaumont called from outside. It's beautiful, I managed to say, even though my throat felt constricted. In the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection wasn't moving with me anymore. It was standing still, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, while the beading on its dress began to move like tiny insects. I tried to unzip the dress, but the zipper wouldn't budge. The beading was definitely moving now, creating patterns that looked like crawling spiders. In the mirror, my reflection started to claw at its throat. I could feel the dress getting tighter, the beads pressing into my skin. That's when I noticed the other reflections in the side mirrors. They weren't my reflections at all. They were other women, all wearing different vintage dresses from the shop, all frozen in poses of terror. Some were clawing at their clothes. Others were trying to run. One was being dragged backward by what looked like animated lace. I screamed and grabbed the zipper with both hands, yanking as hard as I could. It finally gave way with a sound like tearing flesh. I threw the dress off and ran out of the fitting room in my slip, past a startled Madame Beaumont, who called after me in that accented voice. "But dear, it fits you so perfectly." I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My neck was covered in tiny red marks where the beading had pressed into my skin. They formed a pattern that looked like a spider web. The next day, I drove past the shop to prove to myself I had imagined everything. The building was empty, with a "for lease" sign in the window that looked like it had been there for years. But in the window, I saw that same dress I had tried on, now a dull brown instead of burgundy, and the mannequin wearing it was turned away from its reflection, its plastic hands raised, as if trying to protect itself. I never told Kate why. I insisted on modern dresses for her wedding, but sometimes, when I pass by vintage clothing stores, I catch glimpses in their windows of women in beautiful old dresses, pounding silently on the glass, their faces frozen in eternal screams. Last week, I saw a new boutique opening in the historic district. The window display featured a familiar burgundy dress with delicate beading and an elegant sign that read, "Madame Beaumont's Boutique," in flowing script. Through the window, I saw a young woman admiring herself in those 3 ancient mirrors, and I watched in horror as her reflection began to move independently of her. I wanted to run in and warn her, but my feet wouldn't move. All I could do was watch as she smiled at her reflection, unaware that the beading on her dress was starting to crawl. Behind her, Madame Beaumont caught my eye in the window and smiled, her teeth gleaming like polished buttons, and I swear I saw her reflection bow in a completely different direction. They found that woman's body 3 days later, after her family reported her missing. The police report said she was discovered in an abandoned building, wearing what appeared to be an antique dress. The cause of death was listed as strangulation, but the strange part was that the beading on the dress had somehow embedded itself into her skin in an intricate pattern. The dress itself had disintegrated into brown dust when they tried to remove it. Now, whenever I walk past a mirror, I count to 3 before I look at my reflection. They say that's how long it takes to be sure the reflection you're seeing is really yours. And I never, ever try on vintage dresses, because sometimes late at night when I'm alone, I can still hear the whisper of fabric and the gentle tinkling of beads, like hundreds of tiny feet skittering across the floor. And in the corner of my eye, I catch my reflection moving just a fraction of a second too late, wearing a beautiful burgundy dress that I never bought, its beading crawling like spiders across the fabric. The boutique keeps moving, appearing in different cities, different states. I've started tracking the missing persons reports that follow its appearance. Always young women, always found in abandoned buildings, always wearing vintage dresses that crumble to dust. The police never connect the cases, how could they? The shop is never there when they investigate. But I know. I see the pattern in the beading left embedded in their skin. It's growing larger, more complex with each victim. I think it's trying to create something, stitch by stitch, soul by soul. And sometimes when I dream, I see all those reflections trapped in Madame Beaumont's mirrors, wearing their beautiful death shrouds, dancing an endless waltz in a ballroom made of gilt-edged glass, while somewhere, in the darkness beyond the mirrors, something huge and ancient and hungry watches them dance, wearing a dress made of shadows and spiderwebs. I'm sharing this story as a warning. If you ever see a boutique with 3 ancient mirrors and dresses that seem to whisper, walk away. And if you catch your reflection moving wrong, run. Run before the beading starts to crawl, before the fabric begins to tighten, before you become just another beautiful reflection in Madame Beaumont's collection, dancing forever in a dimension where fashion kills. The night is young, and the scares are far from over. On to the next tale. The sweet scent of flowers used to bring me joy. Now it only reminds me of death. Let me tell you how my small-town flower shop became a gateway to something darker than I could have ever imagined. Opening Walker's Flowers was my dream come true. After years of saving and planning, I finally bought old Mrs. Henderson's shop when she retired. The place needed work. The Victorian building had seen better days, and the greenhouse attached to the back was more rust than glass. But it was mine. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I arranged bouquets for birthdays, anniversaries, and the occasional funeral. My regular customers loved how I'd modernized the shop while keeping its vintage charm. Everything was perfect until the roses started dying. It happened suddenly. One morning, every rose in the shop was wilted. Dozens of arrangements, all brown and lifeless. I checked the water, the temperature, everything. Nothing seemed wrong. That's when I noticed the strange spots on the petals, tiny red dots that looked almost like blood. I was cleaning up the dead flowers when I cut my finger on a thorn. A drop of blood fell into the vase water, and that's when it happened. The roses didn't just come back to life, they transformed. Their petals turned a deep, unnatural red, almost black. The scent was intoxicating, unlike anything I'd ever smelled before. Mrs. Patterson, my first customer that day, couldn't resist them. She bought the entire arrangement, despite the price being triple my usual rates. The next day, she was back, desperate for more. Said she couldn't sleep without their scent. But by then, those roses were dead again. That's when I heard it. A whisper so faint I thought I was imagining things. It came from the greenhouse, calling my name. "Amanda, we need to feed." I tried to ignore it. I ordered fresh flowers, but nothing would bloom. They told me what the flowers needed, what they'd always needed. The truth about why Mrs. Henderson had retired so suddenly. Late one night I went to check the greenhouse. The whispers led me to a loose floorboard. Beneath it I found her, what was left of her. Mrs. Henderson's body had become part of the garden, her decomposed form feeding the roots of plants I'd never seen before. Plants that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I should have called the police, should have run away and never looked back. But by then, the whole town was addicted to my flowers. They said my arrangements brought them peace, helped them sleep at night. The mayor's wife claimed her migraines disappeared. The high school principal said his depression lifted. They needed my flowers. And my flowers needed blood. It started small, a few drops from my own fingers. Then mice, rats, stray cats. But the flowers always wanted more. They whispered names to me. Names of people who deserved to feed the garden. The abusive husband, the corrupt businessman, the predatory teacher. Each time I added blood to the water, the flowers bloomed more beautifully than before. Their colors became more vivid, their scents more entrancing. People came from neighboring towns just to buy my arrangements. They said there was something special about them, something that made their problems fade away. But the flowers' hunger grew. They weren't satisfied with the wicked anymore. They wanted innocence, children. I tried to resist, but then the withering started. Not just in my shop, but throughout the town. Gardens dried up. Trees lost their leaves. People got sick. The flowers showed me visions of what would happen if I stopped. Our entire town becoming a desert. Everyone withering away like roses without water. Last week, a reporter started asking questions about the missing persons cases. Too many disappearances in one small town. She bought an arrangement of lilies, the ones I water with young blood. The next day, she came back for more. I saw the look in her eyes, the same desperate need I've seen in all my regular customers. Tonight, she's coming to interview me about my special growing techniques. The flowers are whispering her name. They say she's getting too close, asking too many questions. They say she needs to become part of the garden. I'm writing this down because someone needs to know the truth. If you're reading this, you've probably bought my flowers. You've probably felt their power, breathed in their intoxicating scent. Maybe you're even addicted to them by now. But ask yourself, when was the last time you saw your neighbor? The quiet man who lived alone? The homeless woman who used to sleep behind the library? Did they just move away? Or did they become part of something more permanent? The flowers are calling me now. Another customer needs their special arrangement. And the garden needs to feed. If you ever find yourself in our little town, you might notice how green everything is, how beautifully the flowers bloom. You might wonder why the air smells so sweet, why everyone seems so peaceful and content. Just don't ask what makes the flowers grow so well. And if you hear whispers coming from my greenhouse late at night, if you see shadows moving behind the fogged glass, walk away. Because once the flowers know your name, they never forget, and they're always, always hungry. Some people say they've seen Mrs. Henderson's ghost in the greenhouse at night, tending to the plants with bloody hands. Others swear they've heard screaming coming from beneath the floorboards, but those rumors die quickly in our town. Everyone's too busy enjoying their beautiful gardens, breathing in the special scent that helps them sleep at night. As for me, I've made my peace with what I've become. The flowers chose me for a reason. They need me, just like the town needs them. And as long as they keep blooming, keep providing their special comfort to our community, I'll do whatever it takes to feed them. The reporter's here now. I can hear her car pulling up outside. The flowers are whispering excitedly. They love journalists. Something about the ink in their blood makes the roses bloom extra bright. If you're wise, you'll stay away from Walker's flowers. Find your arrangements somewhere else, somewhere normal. But if you do come, if you do breathe in that special scent and feel that perfect peace wash over you, remember, every flower has its price, and some prices are paid in blood. I have to go now. I have a special delivery to prepare, and the garden is hungry. Always so hungry. That was eerie, but nothing compares to the story coming up. My first day as the new ballet instructor at Riverside Dance Academy started normally enough. The studio was everything you'd expect. Polished wooden floors, ceiling-high mirrors, and a bar running along the walls. The previous teacher, Ms. Eleanor Wright, had left suddenly after 15 years of producing what everyone called the most extraordinary dancers in the state. I was excited to continue her legacy. The morning adult class went smoothly. Then came the afternoon advanced youth class, and that's when things started feeling different. I was teaching the girls, aged 12-16, a particularly challenging sequence from Swan Lake. As I demonstrated the moves, I noticed something odd in the mirror, a shadow that didn't match any of our movements. I blinked, and it was gone. "Okay, girls," from the top, I called out, shaking off the strange feeling. That's when Jessica, one of the younger students, performed a perfect grand jeté that seemed to defy gravity. She hung in the air for what felt like several seconds too long. The other girls didn't seem to notice, but I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After class, I checked the studio's records. Jessica had only been dancing for 2 years. What she did should have been impossible for someone at her level. As I flipped through the files, I found something else strange. Over the past 15 years, at least one student from each graduating class had been admitted to prestigious dance companies worldwide. But after digging deeper, I couldn't find any record of their performances. It was like they disappeared after leaving Riverside. The next few weeks brought more impossibilities. Sarah, usually clumsy during turns, suddenly performed 32 consecutive fouettes without wavering. Emma, who struggled with flexibility, achieved a perfect split leap. Each time these breakthroughs happened, the girls looked drained afterward, pale, with dark circles under their eyes. Parents called it dedication to practice, but I saw how their daughters' movements became more mechanical, more perfect, yet somehow less alive. One evening, while organizing music for the upcoming recital, I noticed light coming from under the studio door. I was sure I'd turned everything off. When I opened the door, the studio was empty, but all the mirrors seemed to ripple like water. In their reflection, I saw dancers, dozens of them, performing in perfect unison. They wore costumes from different eras, their faces familiar from the old performance photos hanging in the lobby. As I watched, horror struck. I realized they were all former Riverside students. The next day, I started asking questions around town. Most people avoided the subject of former Riverside dancers, but old Mrs. Peterson, who lived next door to the studio, finally told me the truth. "Every perfect performance has a price," she whispered, glancing nervously at the studio windows. Eleanor knew that. The theater. It demands payment. Blood and life force traded for perfection. The mirrors remember every sacrifice. I found Eleanor's notebook hidden in a false bottom of her desk drawer. The pages were filled with strange symbols and ritualistic choreography notes. According to her writings, the theater itself was built on ancient grounds, where people once performed sacred dances. The mirrors weren't just mirrors, they were portals, collecting the essence of dancers to fuel supernatural performances. The upcoming spring showcase was to be my first major production as head instructor. During rehearsals, I began seeing things in the mirrors more frequently. Ghostly dancers would appear behind my students, guiding their movements to inhuman perfection. The girls' reflections would continue dancing even after they stopped. Sometimes I caught glimpses of Eleanor herself, watching from the mirror's depths. Yesterday, Jessica collapsed during rehearsal. The doctor called it extreme fatigue, but I saw the truth in the mirror. Her reflection was dancing without her, more graceful than ever, while her physical body lay unconscious on the floor. When she woke up, her eyes were different, empty, like a doll's. The showcase is tomorrow night. All 300 seats in the theater are sold out. In Eleanor's final notes, I found her ultimate plan, a performance so perfect it would require the life force of not just the dancers, but the entire audience. The symbols she drew match the strange patterns I've noticed appearing on the theater walls. I should cancel the show, but every time I try to warn someone, the words stick in my throat. The mirrors are watching, the theater is waiting, and my students, they move so beautifully now. Too beautifully to be human anymore. Tonight, during final rehearsal, I saw my own reflection continue dancing after I stopped. For a moment, just a moment, I understood Eleanor's obsession. The perfection is intoxicating. The theater promises us immortality through art, but at what cost? The curtain rises in 12 hours. I'm sitting in the studio now, watching the mirrors fill with dancers from the past. They're all performing the same piece, the one we're showcasing tomorrow. Their movements are hypnotic, perfect, eternal. I should leave, call off the show, save everyone while I still can. But the music is starting, and my reflection is already dancing. I suppose we'll all find out tomorrow night what matters more, the art or the artist, the performance or the performer. Just remember, if you're ever watching a dance performance that seems too perfect to be real, it probably is. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the mirrors. Sometimes they look back. You might want to turn on a light for this next one. It's that creepy. My family has farmed this land in eastern Nebraska for 3 generations. The work is hard but honest, and we've always managed to scrape by, even in the tough years. That was before I found the diary, before I learned the true cost of controlling the weather. The old leather-bound book turned up while I was clearing out my grandfather's study after his passing. It was tucked away behind a loose panel in the wall, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. I might have missed it completely if the panel hadn't come loose when I was moving his desk. The diary looked ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with careful handwriting in faded brown ink. At first, I thought it was just a farmer's almanac, weather predictions, planting schedules, that sort of thing. But then I noticed the dates. The entries went back over 100 years, with different handwriting styles throughout. The most recent entries were in my grandfather's hand. I would have dismissed it as some kind of family heirloom if it hadn't been for the accuracy. Every weather prediction in that book, going back decades, was perfectly correct. Not just general forecasts, but specific details about temperature, rainfall, wind patterns, everything a farmer needs to know. And not just for a few days ahead, but months into the future. The discovery couldn't have come at a better time. We were facing one of the worst droughts in recent memory, and the bank was breathing down my neck about missed payments. If I could predict the weather with that kind of accuracy, I could save the farm. I just had to figure out how it worked. The answer came in the form of a small note tucked into the back of the diary, written in shaky handwriting I didn't recognize. The book demands sacrifice, blood for accuracy. The greater the offering, the clearer the vision. But beware, once you begin, you cannot stop. The balance must be maintained. I thought it was some kind of joke at first. But that night, as I sat at my kitchen table reading through the diary more carefully, I noticed something odd about the ink. The color wasn't just faded, it was rusty brown, like dried blood. My hands were shaking as I read the detailed instructions hidden among the weather entries. The ritual seemed simple enough. Write your prediction in blood, freely given. The book would show you if you were right or wrong by either accepting the offering, the blood would sink into the page and disappear, or rejecting it, the blood would remain on the surface, tacky and red. I tested it first with a small prediction and a few drops of my own blood, drawn with a sterile needle, just a forecast for the next day's temperature. The blood soaked into the page like water into sand. And sure enough, my prediction was accurate to the degree. But I needed more than just tomorrow's temperature. I needed to know about rainfall, about storms, about all the 1,000 natural threats that could destroy a year's crop in a single day. The diary's instructions were clear about this too. Bigger predictions required bigger sacrifices. That's how it started. A chicken for a week's forecast, a pig for a month's. Each time, I had to use the blood of the sacrifice to write the prediction, and each time the book's accuracy was perfect. I told myself it was necessary, that I was protecting not just my farm but the whole community. After all, accurate weather prediction saves lives, doesn't it? But the book wanted more. Always more. The first time I realized just how dark this path had become was during the tornado season. I needed to know if our area would be hit, needed to be able to warn people in time. The book's pages seemed to whisper to me, demanding a greater sacrifice for such important knowledge. That night, I found myself in my barn with my oldest horse, Thunder. He'd been with us for 15 years. A faithful friend through good times and bad. I still hear his trusting nicker as I approached with the knife. The prediction was perfect, though. Saved the lives of 3 families when I was able to warn them about the F4 tornado that ripped through the county. The guilt started to ease after that. I was helping people, wasn't I? The sacrifices served a greater good, but the book's appetite grew. Small animals no longer satisfied its hunger for longer-range predictions. The blood had to be fresher, the sacrifice more meaningful. The first time it demanded human blood, I nearly burned the damn thing. But by then, I was in too deep. The predictions had become part of the local farming community's survival strategy. People depended on my intuition about the weather, and I'd begun to notice something else. When I skipped a sacrifice or tried to cheat with less than what the book demanded, the weather turned violent, unnatural. It started small at first, unseasonal frost, sudden hailstorms that only hit my fields. But it escalated quickly. The message was clear. maintain the balance, or face the consequences. That's when I found my grandfather's final entry, hidden in code among weather predictions. He explained everything, how the book had been in our family for generations, passed down from farmer to farmer, how each keeper had tried to destroy it, only to face devastating weather events that threatened the entire region, how the sacrifices had gradually escalated over the years, the book's hunger growing with each generation. The diary showed me what happened to those who tried to stop. Entire communities wiped out by freak storms, unprecedented flooding, temperature swings that destroyed crops across multiple states. The book had to be fed, or nature itself would exact a far higher price. I thought I could handle it. Thought I could find a way to beat the system. I experimented with different types of blood, different amounts, trying to satisfy the book's hunger while minimizing the cost. Sometimes it worked. Usually it didn't. The true horror came when I needed to predict the weather for the entire growing season. The book's demands were specific. It had to be family blood, willingly given. I have a brother in Omaha. He's always been the successful one, the one who got out of farming and made something of himself. When he came to visit last month, the book's pages practically hummed with anticipation. I couldn't do it, wouldn't do it. I locked the diary away in my safe and tried to forget about it. That's when the storms started. Not normal storms, but something else. The clouds moved against the wind, forming patterns that looked almost like faces. Lightning struck the same spot repeatedly, burning symbols into my fields that matched the strange markings on the diary's cover. The temperature would swing 40 degrees in a matter of hours, killing crops and confusing livestock. Local meteorologists were baffled. The weather radar showed impossible patterns, storm systems that moved in ways that defied physics. My brother's still coming to visit next week. The diary sits in my safe, its pages growing warm whenever I walk past, like a cat purring in anticipation. The weather forecast shows a massive system building to the west, unlike anything the meteorologists have ever seen. Without an accurate prediction, without the proper sacrifice, it could destroy everything for hundreds of miles. I've written this all down because people need to understand what happens next. Need to know why I made the choices I did. The diary's influence is spreading. I can feel it in the air, see it in the unnatural clouds that gather on the horizon. The longer I resist, the worse it will become. Last night, I found new writing in the diary, written in what looked like fresh blood. The balance must be maintained. The family must pay, or all will pay. The storm is coming. I can hear it in the wind, see it in the way the animals cower in their pens. My brother will be here tomorrow. The diary waits in its safe, its pages crackling with static electricity, demanding its due. And I have to make a choice. But here's the thing that truly terrifies me. I'm starting to think this was never about weather prediction at all. The diary doesn't just forecast the weather, it controls it. Each sacrifice isn't just for knowledge. It's to feed something older than our understanding of meteorology, something that lives in the spaces between raindrops and rides the lightning, the barometers falling, the winds picking up. And in my safe, a book bound in ancient leather calls for blood to maintain a balance I'm only beginning to understand. If you're reading this, if you find this confession, know that whatever happens next isn't really my choice. The diary must be fed, the balance must be maintained, and sometimes the only way to save everyone is to sacrifice someone. The storms are getting closer now. The clouds, they're forming shapes I don't want to describe. My brother's car just pulled into the driveway. The diary's pages are practically vibrating in the safe. I have to go now. Have to make a choice. Have to maintain the balance. But remember this. If you ever find an old leather-bound diary hidden away in some forgotten place, leave it there. Don't open it. Don't read it. And whatever you do, don't write in it. Even if the storms are coming. Even if the crops are dying. Even if the very sky seems to be tearing itself apart. Because once you start, you can never stop. The balance must be maintained. The sacrifice must be made. And the weather must be fed. The clouds are forming faces again. My brother's knocking at the door. The diary calls. God help me. I have to answer. The rest of these pages appear to be stained with something dark and rusty. The local weather report for that day shows no unusual activity, despite multiple witness accounts of impossible storm formations and unexplained atmospheric phenomena. The author's brother was reported missing 3 days later. The case remains unsolved. The diary's current location is unknown, but sometimes on particularly stormy nights, people in eastern Nebraska swear they can see faces in the clouds, hear whispers in the wind, and the weather is always perfect for growing season. Always, no matter what the cost. The last story was unsettling, but trust me, this one will keep you up tonight. Moving back to my grandmother's small town wasn't part of my life plan, but after losing my job in the city, inheriting her quilt shop seemed like a gift from above. Stitch's stories had been a town fixture for over 50 years, and I remembered spending countless hours there as a child, watching Grandma Elizabeth work her magic with fabric and thread. The shop itself was exactly as I remembered. The bell above the door still chimed the same way, and the wooden shelves still held neat stacks of colorful fabric. The only difference was the thick layer of dust that had settled during the 3 months since Grandma's passing. What I didn't expect to find was her private workroom in the back, locked with a key I'd never seen before. It took me a week to find that key hidden inside a hollow leg of her old rocking chair. The workroom was smaller than I imagined, with walls lined with spools of thread. But these weren't normal threads. They had an odd sheen to them, and some looked almost like fine strands of hair. In the center of the room stood a quilting frame with an unfinished piece stretched across it. The pattern was unlike anything I'd seen before. Intricate lines that almost looked like a map. The first strange thing I noticed was the quiet. Even when the shop was full of customers, that back room remained eerily silent, like sound itself couldn't penetrate its walls. Then there were the dreams. Every night after finding that room, I dreamed of people I'd never met, all sleeping under quilts that looked just like the ones in our shop. One morning, Mrs. Peterson came in, looking for a birthday gift for her granddaughter. She picked out one of Grandma's last completed quilts, a beautiful piece with swirling patterns in deep purples and blues. A week later, she returned, pale and shaking. "The dreams," she whispered. "Every night since Sarah started sleeping under that quilt, she dreams of people crying. She says they're trapped in the pattern trying to get out." More stories followed. Each person who bought one of Grandma's quilts reported similar experiences, dreams of trapped souls, whispered pleas in the night, and patterns that seemed to shift when no one was looking. I started examining the quilts more closely, and that's when I noticed something terrifying. Each one had threads that looked exactly like human hair woven into the design. In Grandma's journal, I found entries dating back decades. She wrote about collecting materials and adding to the pattern. There were maps with marked locations, each corresponding to a section of the quilt designs. When I checked the first marked spot, Hidden deep in the woods behind the old cemetery, I found disturbed earth and traces of what looked like shallow graves. The unfinished quilt in the workroom seemed to call to me. Late at night, I could hear whispers coming from behind that locked door. They begged me to complete the pattern, to finish what Grandma started. The voices said if I didn't, all the trapped souls would break free at once, bringing chaos to our world. I started working on the quilt, using the strange threads I found in the room. Each stitch felt like it pulled something from the air itself, and the pattern began to make more sense. It wasn't just a map of the town, it was a map of something else, something darker. With each section I completed, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. People started disappearing from town. Not many at first, a homeless man here, a lonely widow there. But their hair. I kept finding spools of thread that looked just like their hair in the workroom, though I never put them there. The quilt seemed to stitch itself when I wasn't looking, the pattern growing more complex, more complete. Then I found the last entry in Grandma's journal. It explained everything, how she discovered the power of binding souls to quilts, how each quilt was a piece of a larger design. She wrote about a portal that would open when the final quilt was complete, but the last pages were torn out. I still don't know what's supposed to come through that portal, or why the souls need to be trapped to keep it closed. Last night I heard something new in the whispers. They told me there are only 3 more sections needed to complete the pattern, 3 more souls to collect, 3 more threads to weave. The voices are getting harder to ignore, and the unfinished quilt pulses with a strange light when no one else is around. This morning, another customer came in, a young woman looking for a blanket for her new apartment. As I watched her browse, I noticed how her long, dark hair caught the light, how it would look woven into the pattern. The whispers grew excited, and my scissors felt heavy in my pocket. I haven't decided what to do yet. The souls trapped in the quilts beg for release, but they also warn of something worse if they break free. Grandma's last quilt needs to be finished, but at what cost? Each night, the pattern grows clearer, and I can see what it's creating. A door to somewhere else, drawn in thread and sealed with stolen souls. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear Grandma's voice among the whispers, urging me to complete her work. The unfinished quilt glows in the darkness, its pattern shifting like living things trapped beneath the surface. And in the quiet hours before dawn, I sit in her old rocking chair, running my fingers through my own long hair, wondering if it would make good thread. The shop is still open, and people still come in looking for handmade quilts to warm their beds. I sell them the normal ones now, the ones made before Grandma started her grand design. But the special ones, the ones that whisper in the night, those I keep locked away. Because something tells me that once the final stitch is placed, once the pattern is complete, whatever's waiting on the other side of that portal will be far worse than any trapped soul. If you're ever passing through town and see a quilt shop with an old silver bell above the door, come in and look around. The quilts are beautiful, each one a masterpiece of craft and care. But if you hear whispers from the back room, if you see threads that shine like hair in the sunlight, walk away. Some patterns are better left unfinished, some doors better left closed. And if you do buy a quilt, check the threads carefully. If they shimmer in a certain way, if they feel warm to the touch like living things, don't take it home. Don't sleep under it, because once you're part of the pattern, there's no way out. Trust me, I can hear them all now, calling from behind the locked door, begging to be freed or begging me to keep them trapped. Some nights, I'm not sure which would be worse. The unfinished quilt waits in the workroom, its pattern nearly complete. Only 3 more sections to go. Only 3 more souls to collect. Only 3 more threads to weave. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the shop, I think I understand why Grandma chose this path, why she started collecting souls in the first place. Because whatever's on the other side of that portal, whatever's waiting for the pattern to be complete, it's getting impatient, and the scissors in my pocket get heavier every day. The deeper we go, the darker it gets, just like this next story. Taking the night shift at the State Historical Museum seemed like the perfect job for me. The pay was decent, the hours were quiet, and I loved history. My first week was pretty normal, just walking my rounds, checking the security cameras, and making sure none of the motion sensors went off. But things started getting weird during my second week. It began with small stuff that I could almost convince myself I was imagining. The Civil War uniforms in the military exhibit would be slightly turned when I passed by, even though no one had been in the building. Items in the Pioneer Settlement display would move a few inches from where they were supposed to be. At first, I just blamed it on the cleaning crew or maybe my own tired eyes playing tricks on me. Then one night, I was doing my usual 2 a.m. walkthrough when I heard what sounded like metal scraping against glass. It was coming from the Frontier Justice exhibit, the one about famous local crimes from the 1800s. The motion sensors hadn't gone off, but I grabbed my flashlight and went to check anyway. The beam from my flashlight swept across the display cases. And that's when I saw it. The antique sheriff's badge had somehow moved from its mount to the floor of the case. As I got closer, I noticed something else. There were fresh fingerprints on the inside of the glass. I radioed Dave, the other guard on duty, but he was watching the cameras in the security office and said he hadn't seen anyone near that exhibit all night. When I went back later with him to document it for the incident report, the badge was back on its mount, and the fingerprints were gone. That's when things started getting really strange. Every night, more objects would move, but only in certain exhibits, always the ones about violent events in our state's history. The noose used in the last public hanging. The knife from an infamous frontier murder. The blood-stained clothes from an unsolved killing spree. One night, I checked the security footage from my shift and saw something that made my blood run cold. In the recording, the mannequins in the displays were moving, not just shifting slightly, but acting out the historical events they represented. The Pioneer family was running from invisible attackers. The sheriff was drawing his gun. The saloon keeper was reaching for his shotgun. But that wasn't even the worst part. Mixed in with the mannequins was a figure I recognized. Bob Thompson, the guard who had worked here before me. He had quit suddenly about a month ago, with no explanation. In the footage, he was dressed in period clothing, moving stiffly like the mannequins, his face frozen in a look of terror as he acted out scenes from the past. I tried showing the footage to my supervisor, but whenever anyone else watched it, the tapes showed nothing but empty exhibits. They started giving me concerned looks and suggesting I take some time off, but I knew what I had seen. Then I started finding notes, written in a shaky hand I didn't recognize. History needs to be preserved. The past must be fed. Someone has to play their part. The last one was the worst. If we don't give it what it wants, it takes it anyway. I started researching the museum's history. Turns out, there had been a pattern of disappearances over the years, mostly night guards, but also some visitors who had stayed too late. Each time, security footage would mysteriously disappear, and investigations would lead nowhere. But the really scary thing? After each disappearance, the historical displays would become more accurate. Bloodstains would appear on uniforms that had been cleaned before. Weapons would show signs of use they hadn't had previously. Items would carry the actual scents and marks of the events they were supposed to represent. Last week I found an old journal hidden behind one of the displays. It was written by a guard from the 1960s, and what I read made everything terrifyingly clear. The museum doesn't just preserve history, it hungers for it. Each violent display needs to be refreshed periodically with new blood, new terror, new victims to maintain its historical accuracy. If no one volunteers, it takes who it needs. The guard who wrote the journal said he had figured out a way to satisfy the museum's hunger by bringing it fresh victims. That's why he lasted so long in the job. But in his last entry, he wrote that the museum's appetite was growing. It wasn't satisfied with just one victim at a time anymore. It wanted to recreate entire historical events, with full casts. Now I understand why Bob Thompson disappeared. He probably tried to resist, tried to break the cycle. But the museum won't let that happen. It needs its players for its historical reenactments. Last night I saw Bob again in the security footage. He was in the Pioneer Settlement display, dressed as a settler, acting out a massacre from 1845. But this time, he looked right at the camera. His mouth moved, forming words I could barely make out. Your turn is coming. The museum is getting hungry again. I can feel it. The displays are starting to move more at night, and the sounds of historical violence echo through the halls. Gunshots from the Civil War exhibit, screams from the Frontier Justice display, the clash of Native American battles. I've tried to quit, but something won't let me. Every time I write my resignation letter, my hands shake so bad I can't sign it. Every time I think about not coming in, my chest gets tight and I can barely breathe. The museum has chosen me for its next performance. That's why I'm writing this all down. Maybe someone will find it and understand what's happening here. Maybe they'll figure out how to stop it, but I doubt it. The museum has been doing this for too long, feeding its hunger for historical accuracy with fresh blood. Tonight, the exhibits are especially restless. The mannequins are already starting to twitch and turn. I can hear footsteps in the Civil War gallery, even though I'm the only one here. The antique weapons are rattling in their cases, and I just found a costume laid out in the security office. A Union soldier's uniform, perfectly my size. There's a note pinned to it. The Battle of Cedar Creek begins at midnight. All participants must be in historical dress. The museum needs its players, and now it's my turn to become part of its permanent collection. To act out violent moments from the past, over and over, feeding its endless hunger for historical authenticity. If you're reading this, and you're thinking about taking the night guard position at the State Historical Museum, don't. Some history isn't meant to be preserved. Some exhibits should be left to gather dust. And some museums don't just display the past, they recreate it, one victim at a time. I hear the battle drums starting now. The uniforms are moving by themselves, and I can smell gunpowder in the air. Midnight is coming, and the museum is calling its players to their positions. I don't know if I'll be here tomorrow to write more. But there's one thing I know for sure. Somewhere in these halls, in these endlessly repeating scenes of historical violence, Bob Thompson is waiting for me to join the exhibition. And somewhere in this museum, there's already a display case with my name on it, waiting to house another piece of living history. Don't get too comfortable. The next tale will pull you right back into the fear. The old candy shop on Maple Street had been closed for as long as anyone could remember. Its faded storefront and dusty windows were just part of the neighborhood scenery. until Richard Thompson bought it at auction. That's when everything in our small town started to change. I run the bookstore across the street, which gave me a front row seat to the shop's transformation. At first, everyone was excited. Richard seemed nice enough, quiet, polite, always wearing that crisp white apron. He spent weeks fixing up the place, and soon the windows gleamed with displays of the most beautiful candies anyone had ever seen. The grand opening drew quite a crowd. People said his candies tasted like nothing they'd ever experienced before. Each piece was handcrafted, wrapped in delicate paper with a little golden T stamped on top. The prices were steep, but nobody seemed to mind. There was something special about Thompson's confectionery that kept people coming back. I was one of his first regular customers. Every morning, I'd stop in for a piece of his signature butterscotch. The flavor was incredible, sweet at first, then complex, with hints of something I could never quite identify. Richard would always be there behind the counter, carefully arranging his displays. Sometimes I caught him watching customers as they ate his candies, an odd little smile on his face. The strange things started happening gradually. First, it was just weird coincidences. People who bought Richard's candies seemed to have bad luck afterward. Little things at first, stubbed toes, paper cuts, minor accidents. But it got worse. Mrs. Peterson broke her arm the day after buying a box of his chocolate truffles. The Johnson kids all came down with high fevers after sharing a bag of his lemon drops. I started paying more attention to the shop. Sometimes, late at night, I'd see lights moving in the back room, hear strange humming sounds. The sweet smell from his shop began to change, still sugary, but with an underlying scent that reminded me of hospitals. Children started having nightmares about the candy shop. They said they could hear crying coming from the basement when they walked past. Parents dismissed it as imagination, but I wasn't so sure. I'd seen things through my bookstore window, shadows moving when Richard was supposedly alone, strange lights flickering behind the frosted glass of his workroom. One night, I stayed late at the bookstore doing inventory. Around midnight, I heard screaming coming from the candy shop. Not just any screaming. It sounded like dozens of voices all at once, young and old, twisted together in agony. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, everything was quiet. Richard showed them around, laughing it off as old pipes and a faulty radio, but I knew what I'd heard. I started researching the shop's history. The previous owner, an old man named Marcus Green, had disappeared 50 years ago, along with 3 local children. They were last seen entering his shop after hours. The cases were never solved. The more I dug, the worse it got. Every decade or so, children would go missing in our town. Always in threes, always near the candy shop. Different owners each time, but the same pattern. And now Richard was here, making his special candies with their strange, unforgettable taste. I broke into the shop one night. I had to know. The basement was locked with 3 heavy padlocks, but I'd brought tools. What I found down there, I still can't talk about all of it. The walls were covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like dried molasses. Glass jars lined the shelves filled with swirling, glowing substances, and the sounds, whispers, crying, begging, seemed to come from the candies themselves. In the center of the room stood a massive copper pot, crusted with something dark. Beside it was Richard's recipe book. I only read a few pages before I got sick. Crystallized tears of children, one recipe called for. Essence of fresh grief. Distilled pain, aged 7 years. I ran upstairs and found Richard waiting. He wasn't smiling anymore. "We all have to eat," he said softly. "The candies must be made. They must be fed, or they'll take us all." I don't remember how I got out. The police found me wandering downtown the next morning. When they checked the shop, Richard was gone. The basement was empty except for ordinary candy-making equipment. No jars, no symbols, no recipe book, but the candies remained. And people still buy them. The shop never closes now. It runs itself. Perfect candies appearing in the display case each morning. I've tried warning people, but who would believe me? The candies taste so good, they say. So special, so unique. I watch from my bookstore window as children press their faces against the candy shop glass. Sometimes I think I see Richard's reflection behind them, smiling that strange smile. Sometimes I hear the whispers floating across the street, crying, begging, screaming, trapped in sugar and chocolate. The worst part? I still crave those butterscotch candies. Even knowing what I know, something pulls me toward that shop. Each piece of candy holds a different pain, a different scream, a different soul. And somewhere in that other dimension, Richard is still making his special recipes, crafting perfect sweets from perfect suffering. Last week, 3 children disappeared. Just like before, the police searched the candy shop but found nothing. Of course they didn't. The portal only opens for those who know where to look, who know what the candies really are. I'm writing this now because I know I won't resist much longer. The craving is too strong. Each day I wake up thinking about those butterscotch candies. My mouth waters remembering their taste, sweet, then complex, then something else. Something that might be someone else's pain, or fear, or despair. Tomorrow I'll go back to the shop. One last piece of candy, I tell myself. But I know better. Richard knows better. The candies must be made. They must be fed. And soon, very soon, I'll understand exactly what that means. If you're ever driving through our town, you might see Thompson's Confectionery with its gleaming windows and beautiful displays. The candies will call to you perfect, delicious, unique. But before you take a bite, listen closely. That sound you hear? It's not your imagination. Those aren't just candies in the jars. They're screaming. And somewhere, in a dimension of eternal suffering, Richard Thompson is still making his special recipes. One batch at a time, one soul at a time. The candies must be made. They must be fed. Or they'll take us all. The scariest part? The night's terrors have only just begun. Moving to San Francisco wasn't easy, but sometimes you have to start fresh. After my divorce, the small-town whispers back in Iowa became too much to handle. Plus, the city had always called to me, its fog-shrouded streets promising new beginnings for artists like me. My tiny studio apartment doubled as my workspace, with an easel by the window overlooking the busy street below. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free to paint whatever I wanted. That freedom lasted exactly 3 months. It started with Mrs. Chen from the corner store. She'd been kind to me since I arrived, always slipping extra fruit into my grocery bags and asking about my artwork. When she mentioned wanting her portrait painted, I jumped at the chance. My first real commission in the city. "Make it special," she said with a wink. "Something to remember me by." I set up my supplies that evening, choosing a fresh canvas and my favorite brushes. The paint wasn't cooperating, though. Everything looked flat and lifeless. Frustrated, I accidentally cut my finger on the canvas edge. A drop of blood fell onto the white surface. That's when everything changed. The moment my blood touched the canvas, colors began flowing like water. My hands moved on their own, brushstrokes quick and sure. I painted for hours without stopping, lost in some kind of trance. When I finally stepped back, I gasped. The portrait showed Mrs. Chen lying in the street, her body twisted at an odd angle. A red bicycle lay nearby, its wheel still spinning. The detail was incredible. I could see every wrinkle in her clothes, every strand of scattered gray hair. But her eyes held such terror. I tried destroying the painting, tore it from the frame, tried burning it, even took it to the dumpster. But every morning it would be back on my easel, perfectly intact. 3 days later, Mrs. Chen was hit by a cyclist while crossing the street. She died instantly. The scene matched my painting exactly. I told myself it was a horrible coincidence, locked my brushes away, and swore never to paint another portrait. But then the dreams started. Every night, I saw myself painting. The canvases would multiply endlessly, each one showing a different death. I'd wake up covered in sweat, my fingers stained with paint I didn't remember using. That's when I found the note, written in elegant script on the back of Mrs. Chen's portrait. The gallery requires new works. Blood feeds the canvas. Paint or become the painted. I tried ignoring it. Really, I did. But after a week of no sleep and increasingly vivid nightmares, I gave in. Just one more portrait, I told myself, to prove it wasn't real. My next subject was Tom, the barista at my local coffee shop. Nice guy, always remembered my order. The painting showed him falling from his apartment window, reaching desperately for something just out of frame. 2 days later, it happened exactly as I'd painted it. And so it continued. Each portrait needed a drop of blood from the previous subject to begin. Each one showed someone's final moments in perfect, terrible detail. Each death played out exactly as I'd painted it, down to the smallest detail. I tried warning them sometimes, but no one ever believed me. How could they? Your portrait shows how you're going to die isn't exactly an easy conversation starter. The worst part was discovering I wasn't alone. There were others like me scattered throughout the city, painters, sculptors, photographers, all of us trapped in this macabre game, creating death art for the mysterious gallery. I found their signatures hidden in their works. Maria Suarez's photographs capturing the exact moment of fatal accidents. James Chen's sculptures showing bodies frozen in their final poses. Sarah Williams' charcoal sketches of peaceful faces that would never wake up. We met in secret, sharing what little we knew. The gallery had existed for centuries, collecting souls through art. Each piece had to be created voluntarily, with the artist's own creative energy feeding the process. Those who refused or tried to stop, well, they became subjects instead of artists. I saw it happen to Sarah. She tried breaking free, destroying her materials and running away. A week later, I was compelled to paint her portrait. She was sitting at her desk, head bowed as if sleeping. Carbon monoxide poisoning, the paper said. A faulty heater. Her blood made the perfect primer for my next canvas. Sometimes I wonder about the first artist, the one who started all this. There's a painting in the City Museum that might hold the answer. A self-portrait from the 1800s showing a woman at her easel. But if you look closely, really closely, you can see she's painting another canvas within the painting. And in that tiny canvas is another painter, working on another portrait, on into infinity. I've tried researching the artist, but her name has been lost to history. Just another mysterious death in a city full of them. The gallery keeps growing. Every week, new works appear in various museums and private collections around the city. Beautiful, haunting pieces that capture the exact moment between life and death. Regular people just see art. We know better. I'm still painting. Have to keep painting. Right now, my easel holds a half-finished portrait of a young woman walking her dog by the bay. The fog is rolling in thick around her. Soon, she'll step too close to the edge, not realizing the railing is rusted through. But here's the thing that really keeps me up at night. I've started noticing other artists watching me, sketching me, taking photos when they think I'm not looking. I know what that means. Somewhere out there, my portrait is already being created. I just hope whoever's painting it makes it beautiful. My latest canvas is almost dry now. The blood primer makes the colors so vivid, so alive. Ironic, isn't it? But I have to keep going, have to keep creating, because the moment I stop, I know I'll end up on someone else's canvas. Sometimes at night, I swear I can hear the paintings whispering to each other, sharing stories of lives ended, souls captured. The gallery must be fed. The art must continue. If you're ever in San Francisco, pay attention to the art you see. Really look at it. And if you notice a painting that seems too real, too alive, don't stare too long. You might find yourself becoming part of the collection. Just remember, every portrait tells a story. Some are just waiting to be finished. And whatever you do, don't let an artist paint your portrait. Especially if they cut themselves while working. That's how it always begins. The canvas is calling again. Another portrait needs to be painted. Another story needs to end. After all, the gallery must be fed. You survived the last one, but the next story might just push you over the edge. The letter about Aunt Mabel's inheritance arrived on a rainy Tuesday in October. I hadn't seen her in 15 years. Not since that awkward Christmas dinner where she kept insisting I would someday understand the family business. Now she was gone, and she'd left me the Primrose Inn, her beloved bed and breakfast in rural Massachusetts. I'd just lost my job in tech during the latest round of layoffs, so the timing seemed perfect. Running a B couldn't be that hard, right? Clean rooms, serve breakfast, make small talk with guests. Simple. The Primrose stood 3 stories tall, all weathered brick and ivy-covered walls. It had that classic New England charm tourists love. Dormer windows, wraparound porch, even a widow's walk up top. The interior was exactly what you'd expect. Floral wallpaper, antique furniture, creaky hardwood floors. Everything smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, had worked there for decades. She greeted me with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your aunt left very specific instructions," she said, handing me a leather-bound notebook. "The inn has special needs, special rules. Follow them exactly." I flipped through the notebook that evening. Most of it seemed like standard hospitality stuff, but some entries were weird. Always keep room 12 vacant. Never change the paintings. Feed it well. That last one was underlined 3 times. The first few weeks went smoothly enough. The guests seemed happy, though they often had strange questions at breakfast. "Did you hear the singing last night? Was someone playing a piano at 3 a.m.? Who was that little girl in the hallway?" We didn't have a piano. Or a little girl. Then the dreams started. Not my dreams, the guests' dreams. They'd share them over coffee and homemade scones, laughing about the coincidences. I dreamed I got that promotion, and this morning my boss called. In my dream, I found my lost wedding ring, and when I woke up, I dreamed I could fly, and now my feet don't quite touch the ground. That last guest disappeared 2 days later. The police found no evidence she'd ever checked in. Her room was spotless. No luggage, no reservation in the system. But I remembered her. I remembered them all. Mrs. Chen seemed unsurprised. "The inn provides what guests desire most," she said. "But it requires balance. Payment." I noticed things after that. How the hallway mirrors sometimes showed different reflections. The way shadows moved against the light. The constant, gentle humming in the walls that sounded almost like breathing. The notebook made more sense now. Every third Tuesday, leave a raw steak in the basement. Monthly sage burning in specific patterns. And most importantly, room 12. Always vacant, always locked. But every morning the sheets would be rumpled. The water in the bathroom would be warm. Chen would hurry to clean. I tried closing the inn. The pipes burst that night, flooding every room except number 12. I tried calling contractors to renovate. They all had accidents before reaching the property. I tried selling, but every realtor mysteriously lost my number. The dreams got worse. Guests started waking up with everything they'd wished for, but twisted. The woman who wanted children? She woke up pregnant, 6 months pregnant overnight. The man hoping to reconcile with his estranged son? The son showed up at breakfast, but something was wrong with his eyes, his smile, the way he moved. Mrs. Chen found me trying to burn the place down one night. The matches wouldn't light. The gasoline turned to water. She sat me down in the kitchen, poured 2 cups of tea, and finally told me everything. The Primrose wasn't just an inn. It was more like a filter, she explained. People's dreams, their desires, their nightmares. The building fed on them, processed them, made them real. But like any digestive system, it produced waste. Dark things, wrong things, things that needed somewhere to go. That's what room 12 was for. That's what the special guests were for. The ones whose reservations I didn't remember taking, who checked in late at night, who never came down for breakfast. The ones the inn needed to maintain balance. "Your aunt understood," Mrs. Chen said. "She kept the balance for 40 years. Now it's your turn. I check the bookings every morning now. I can spot them easily, the special guests. Their names seem to shimmer on the page. They never have luggage. They always take room 12. I tell myself they're not real people. They can't be. Real people don't smile like that, don't have shadows that move independently, don't leave handprints burned into the sheets. But sometimes I wonder. Sometimes, in the deep night when the inn is humming contentedly, I hear them crying in room 12. And sometimes their cries sound almost like relief. The dreams keep coming true. The inn keeps running. Mrs. Chen keeps cleaning. And every morning, I check the guest book, looking for shimmering names, trying not to count how many special guests we've had, trying not to calculate the balance. I understand the family business now, Aunt Mabel. I understand why you chose me. I just wish I knew whether it was because you thought I could handle it, or because the inn was hungry for someone new. Last week, I found a letter in the notebook I somehow hadn't noticed before. It was from Aunt Mabel, written in shaky handwriting. "Remember, dear, the inn isn't evil. It's just hungry. And better it feeds on the willing than takes what it needs some other way. Better we choose who goes into room 12 than let it choose for itself. Keep it fed, keep it happy, and most of our guests will leave with their dreams fulfilled. Most of them. I serve breakfast every morning now. Fresh coffee, warm scones, and a question. Did anyone have interesting dreams last night? I listen to their answers carefully. Watch their faces as they talk about wishes granted and desires fulfilled. And I pray I don't see that slight shimmer around them, that telltale sign that the inn has marked them for room 12. Some nights, when I'm alone in my office, I swear I can feel the inn watching me, evaluating me, wondering, perhaps, if I'll make a good special guest someday. But that's the thing about running a business, isn't it? You have to be willing to sacrifice everything for success. Sweet dreams, dear guests. Sweet dreams. That chill in the air? It's the next story, creeping closer. The sound of violins filled the hallways of Preston Academy of Music as I walked to my classroom that September morning. It was my first day as the new violin teacher, replacing Mrs. Eleanor Wright, who had vanished 3 months ago. Only her car and violin case remained behind. I'm Rebecca Williams, and teaching violin at Preston Academy was supposed to be my dream job. The Victorian mansion-turned-music school was beautiful, with its dark wood panels and perfect acoustics, but something felt wrong from day one. That first morning I heard a flawless rendition of Paganini's Caprice No. 24 coming from practice room 3. It was the kind of performance you'd expect at Carnegie Hall, not a school. When I opened the door, the room was empty. The music stopped mid-note. "That must have been Amy Chen," said Mrs. Patterson, the piano teacher. But when I met Amy later, she could barely handle Mozart. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. Over the next weeks, more impossible performances echoed through empty rooms. Students who'd struggled with basic pieces suddenly played like masters, but each perfect performance left them looking paler and weaker. During evening lessons, footsteps creaked above, though the third floor was closed for renovations. Working late one night, I found a 1923 concert program. The photograph showed children with their instruments, and behind them stood someone identical to Mrs. Wright. Not similar, identical. Same face, same slight smile, same everything. Research revealed darker secrets. Before becoming a music school in 1875, the building was an orphanage. A fire in 1872 killed 37 children, buried somewhere on the property in a mass grave. As the winter concert approached, the strange events intensified. In Mrs. Wright's desk, I found sheet music written in what looked like wet, red ink that seemed to move when I wasn't watching. It smelled like copper. The night before the concert, around midnight, I heard a full orchestra playing from the third floor. The music was wrong somehow. Beautiful but sickening. Against my better judgment, I went upstairs. The renovation signs were gone. Through the recital hall door, I saw 30 children in old-fashioned clothes playing instruments. Their faces were too pale, too still. Among them were my current students, playing with the same unnatural perfection while their faces grew gaunt. Conducting them was Mrs. Wright, but wrong, too tall, too thin, with reflective eyes and too many teeth. She saw me. The children turned, revealing black, hollow eyes. I ran as the music became frenzied behind me, pursued by countless footsteps and scraping instruments. The police found nothing except old bones under the recital hall floor, children's bones mixed with ancient violin fragments. I quit immediately. The winter concert went ahead with a new teacher. Every student performed perfectly, and 3 collapsed afterward from exhaustion. They recovered but couldn't remember how to play anymore. Last week, I received a package containing a violin bow stained dark red and sheet music written in that same wet ink. The note read, "The children need a teacher. They're waiting for you." The music sits on my desk, playing itself at night. The notes move when I'm not looking. My hands have started conducting on their own, and the melody gets louder every day. If your child suddenly shows impossible musical talent, if they come home drained after every practice, if they hum melodies that make your head spin, get them out of Preston Academy, because the children are still playing, still practicing, still performing, and their orchestra needs new members. I can hear the violins now, getting closer. My hands are moving again, conducting an invisible orchestra, and somehow I know I'll be returning to Preston Academy soon. After all, the children need their teacher. Some stories are spooky, but the next one? It's absolutely bone-chilling. Taking the job as a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest seemed like a dream come true. After years of working desk jobs in the city, I was ready for some peace and quiet. The posting was perfect. A remote station deep in the old-growth forest. Just me and the wilderness. The pay was good, too good, really, and now I know why. My first week was exactly what I expected. I checked trails, logged wildlife sightings, and enjoyed the solitude. The previous ranger, Tom Harris, had left suddenly after 15 years of service. The Forest Service said he'd had a family emergency, but something felt off about how they avoided talking about him. It started with small things. I'd find strange patterns of twigs and bones arranged in circles near my cabin. At first, I blamed teenagers, but the nearest town was 30 miles away, and these formations appeared overnight, even when the gates were locked. Then I noticed the deer acting weird. They'd stand on their hind legs and watch me through my cabin windows, heads tilted like they were trying to understand something. When I approached, they'd drop to all fours and bound away, but not before I saw an almost human awareness in their eyes. The trees were wrong, too. I'd studied forestry in college, and something about their growth patterns didn't make sense. There were patches of forest where the trees grew impossibly fast, reaching heights in months that should have taken decades. These areas always had the richest, darkest soil I'd ever seen. And the strangest thing, they were perfectly circular. One morning, I found my predecessor's logbook hidden behind a loose panel in the cabin. The entries started normal enough: wildlife counts, weather patterns, trail maintenance, but as the years went on, Tom's writings became increasingly strange. He wrote about voices in the wind and trees that moved when no one was watching. The final entries were barely readable, filled with rambling descriptions of feeding the forest and becoming one with the green. That's when I started finding the bones. Small ones at first, scattered around those circles of rapid tree growth. I told myself they were animal remains, but deep down, I knew they weren't. The Forest Service brushed off my reports, saying I was just unused to wilderness. But they didn't see how the birds would form perfect circles in the sky, or how the squirrels would line up at my window each morning, standing like tiny people. I tried to leave after 3 months, packed my truck and everything, but every road led me back to my cabin, even ones I knew should have taken me to the highway. The GPS would go crazy, spinning in circles, and the compass pointed to different norths. The forest wanted me here. That's when I found the cave. It wasn't on any of my maps, but one day it was just there, a dark mouth in the hillside surrounded by those impossibly tall trees. Inside I found evidence of ancient rituals, Stone altars stained dark brown, walls covered in carvings of people merging with trees, and in the deepest chamber, I found Tom's ranger badge, fused into the living rock like it had grown there. The forest has been teaching me things since then, how it needs to be fed to stay healthy, how each ranger before me learned the same lesson. The trees, they grow so fast because of what's buried beneath them. Those perfect circles, they're markers, each one a offering from a previous caretaker. The soil is so dark and rich because of what it contains. Last week, a group of hikers went missing in my sector. The Forest Service sent out a search party, but they won't find anything. The trees in the Northwest Grove are growing especially well this spring. I understand now why the animals watch me so carefully. They're not really animals anymore, not entirely. They're the ones who failed to learn, who resisted their role as caretaker. The deer with human eyes, the birds that move in perfect formation. They're what happens when you try to leave without selecting your replacement. Tom knew. That's why he stayed so long, why he kept such detailed records. The forest needs its tribute, and the ranger must provide. It's a cycle as old as these woods. We feed the forest, and in return, it keeps the outside world at bay. Because if we don't, if the offerings stop, the forest will reach beyond its boundaries. Those impossibly fast-growing trees? They're getting closer to the nearest town every day. I've started keeping my own logbook now, hidden where the next ranger will find it. They'll need to understand what's required of them. The forest is patient, but it must be fed. Every circle of trees marks a choice. Someone who chose to serve the forest, or someone who didn't understand their role until it was too late. Sometimes at night, I hear Tom's voice in the wind. He made his choice, became one with the green, as he called it. The carvings in the cave show what that means. The final transformation, when a ranger truly embraces their role as caretaker. I've started to see the signs in myself. My skin has a slight green tint in the sunlight, and yesterday I found moss growing in the crook of my arm. I didn't remove it. The forest is growing stronger. Last month, 3 different search parties came looking for missing hikers. They didn't find what they were looking for, but the trees, they grew another 10 feet. The rangers before me understood. This is how we keep the balance. The forest feeds, and in return, it stays within its boundaries. For now, I've noticed more circles of bones appearing lately, forming patterns I'm only beginning to understand. The animals gather in larger groups now, moving with unsettling coordination. Last night, I saw a bear reading one of my posted trail maps, its paw moving across the paper like it was checking directions. When it noticed me watching, it dropped to all fours. But not before I saw the true human intelligence in its eyes. The missing persons reports have started appearing in the local papers. The Forest Service deflects questions, just like they did when Tom disappeared. They know what happens here, have known for generations. This forest has been here longer than the country itself, and it has always required caretakers. I found more of Tom's notes yesterday, carved into a tree that wasn't there last week. The bark had formed words, describing the final stage of transformation. He wrote about roots instead of feet, leaves instead of hair, his consciousness spreading through the mycological network that connects all living things in the forest. He's part of it now, just like all the rangers who came before him, just like I will be. The forest is hungry again. I can feel it in the way the ground pulses beneath my feet, in the whispers that come through my radio even when it's turned off. The trees at the forest's edge are moving closer to civilization, inch by inch, day by day. Soon, I'll need to make a choice, find another offering, or become one myself. This morning, I found a new ranger application on my desk. I don't remember receiving it, but the forest has its ways. The applicant seems perfect, young, eager, no family ties, just like I was. The cycle continues, as it must. If you're reading this, you might be the next caretaker of Blackwood National Forest. Look for the signs, the circles of bones, the trees that grow too fast, the animals that aren't quite animals anymore. When you find them, you'll have a choice to make. Choose wisely. The forest is always watching, always hungry, always growing. And if you hear whispers in the wind that sound like my voice, or see a green-tinged figure moving through the trees just at the edge of your vision, don't be afraid. We all serve the forest in our own way. Some of us just become more permanent fixtures than others. The trees are growing faster now, their branches reaching like fingers toward the sky. Last night, I swear I saw one of them walking, its roots pulling free from the earth with a sound like tearing flesh. The forest is getting impatient. It needs its tribute. I've started marking the trees near the hiking trails with warnings, but the forest keeps absorbing them, the bark growing over my carved messages within hours. It doesn't want to scare away potential offerings. The hunger must be fed. Tomorrow I'll interview the new ranger applicant. The forest has chosen them, just as it chose me. I'll show them the cave, the circles, the logbooks. They'll learn, just as I did, just as Tom did before me. And if they don't, well, the trees need to eat, and the deer with human eyes always need new company. Remember, if you're ever hiking in Blackwood National Forest, and you see perfect circles of tall trees, or animals that move a little too deliberately, or a green-tinted ranger whose feet seem to sink into the ground, turn back. The forest is always hungry, always growing, always watching, and it hasn't forgotten what civilization took from it all those centuries ago. They say you can't hear the trees grow, but that's not true, not here. In Blackwood, you can hear them at night, a sound like cracking bones and stretching skin. That's the sound of the forest feeding, of nature reclaiming what was always hers. One offering at a time, one ranger at a time, one transformation at a time. The forest is calling. I can feel my transformation beginning. Soon I'll join Tom and all the others, become part of the ancient network of roots and fungi that connects everything in this place. But first, I need to ensure the cycle continues. The new ranger arrives tomorrow. The forest is hungry, and the trees must grow.